Hello, everyone. Omni-sensei here with What If I Were Reborn in World War II Marvel as Dimensional Trader? Part 2. If you enjoy this kind of content, please hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description. Now, let's dive into it. I want a divorce. Hearing Margaret's words, to be honest, Josh was a bit confused. If you want to leave, just leave. Why tell me? We've only known each other for a few days, sister. Of course, even though Josh had never been married in his previous life, it didn't mean he was slow to pick up on such matters. If he spoke his mind directly, the goodwill he had built with Margaret so far might not drop to zero instantly, but it would surely take a big hit. From what you've said, it seems like he doesn't really love you. When he married you back then, it was probably for your immense wealth. It's good to get a divorce sooner rather than later anyway. You're still young, and you have a bright future ahead of you. There's no need to waste it on someone like that. After Margaret vented her frustrations, Josh comforted her. His words were sincere. As long as Margaret wasn't lying, it was obvious what kind of person Tony Windies was. He used his fame as a sports star to sweep young Margaret off her feet, dazzling her. When Margaret's father was still alive, he behaved well at home, acting like a model husband. But after Margaret's father passed away, and once he realized Margaret was easier to manipulate, things changed. He traveled around the world under the pretense of participating in competitions. Of course, he did compete, but in between, he indulged in debauchery. His performance in competitions was sharply decreasing, comparable to a certain soccer team. But he didn't care because Margaret had money. Why would Margaret keep someone like that around? Plus, even though she's been married to him for 7 years, Margaret is only 26 years old. When that guy started going after her, she was just 18, and they married when she was 19. After Josh's comforting words, Margaret's mood improved significantly compared to when she arrived, and her resolve to divorce grew stronger. However, as noon approached, she was ready to say goodbye to Josh. Not staying for lunch? Josh asked, somewhat surprised. No, I have an appointment with Uncle John at noon to discuss the matter of your gold. Also, I need his help with my divorce. Margaret explained. Josh understood and immediately offered to drive her. But Margaret politely declined, saying she could handle these things herself. She only asked Josh to walk her to the door. Watching Margaret drive away, Josh returned to the house, ready to go out as well. Over the past 2 days, because of the move and his dates with Margaret, he hadn't been able to get much done during the day. As a result, he could only chat with Daenerys during the trading hours at night. That wouldn't do. It was time to restock inventory, and he also needed to prepare the books Daenerys had requested. Just as he was about to leave, his neighbor Tommy called out to him. Is something wrong, Tommy? Josh asked, puzzled. Yeah, I just wanted to ask if Margaret has offended anyone recently. Tommy organized his thoughts before asking. Why do you ask? Josh was confused by the question. When Margaret came over earlier, I noticed a black car parked across the street. It seemed to be watching your place, but at the time, I wasn't entirely sure. Just now, when Margaret left, that same car followed her. That's when I realized the car must be tailing Margaret. Tommy quickly explained the situation to Josh and gave him the car's license plate number. What? Someone's tailing Margaret? Josh was stunned. Then came the anxiety. Although they hadn't known each other long, and Josh had initially intended to use her to some extent, he was well aware of Margaret's kindness and help toward him. He wasn't a heartless or ungrateful person. He couldn't just stand by when Margaret might be in danger. He immediately thanked Tommy and drove off in the direction Margaret had gone. Since some time had passed since Margaret left, it would be nearly impossible to catch up with her under normal circumstances. And in this era, there were no mobile phones or pagers, so Josh had no way of contacting her. Fortunately, when they discussed Uncle John earlier, Margaret had mentioned the name and address of the jewelry company. If he went there, he should either run into Margaret or at least be able to ask about her and John's whereabouts. Josh could only hope that if someone was indeed following Margaret, they wouldn't act too soon. As Josh drove away, Tommy watched him leave, reminded of his younger, more energetic self. But he quickly shook his head. Back then, he had started from nothing, a penniless refugee. It had taken him decades of hard work to afford his current home. This young man was starting off at a much higher point than he ever did. Besides, Tommy's past was filled with shady dealings, the kind that made people despise him. There's no comparing, no comparing. Josh sped down the road, but a traffic cop flagged him down. After all, Roosevelt's administration wasn't just for show. However, the anxious Josh pulled out some cash. When he encountered a cop, he casually tossed out a $100 bill. In this era, there were no body cams, and corruption among federal officers was rampant. But at any time, a patrol officer's salary was one of the lowest. $100 was more than what they'd usually make in a month on the side. So Josh drove on unimpeded and soon arrived at the building where the jewelry company was located. After driving around the parking lot, Josh finally spotted the familiar Packard. His previously tense nerves relaxed a little. Since the car was here, it meant Margaret hadn't encountered any danger on the way. This was downtown, and even if someone planned to act, they wouldn't likely do it here. So Margaret should be safe for now. With that thought, Josh didn't rush out of the car. Instead, he drove a bit further, parked in a discreet spot, and cautiously returned to observe the area around the Packard. This was a business district parking lot, with security patrolling regularly, so he wasn't too worried about the car being stolen. Plus, he was driving a Lincoln, a luxury car that few thieves would target because it would be difficult to sell. After carefully observing, Josh spotted the black sedan. But when he saw who was in the car, Josh was taken aback. It was the Italian guy who had stolen his car a few days ago. What was he doing here? Josh frowned. After thinking it over, he stepped back. It wasn't that he didn't want to do anything, but cars and people were coming and going frequently, and it wasn't very discreet. Since they were watching Margaret, he would watch them. With that thought, Josh returned to his hiding spot, making sure no one was around, and stashed his Lincoln in his system storage. He then replaced it with a regular car he had previously borrowed. In the parking lot of the business district, Joe's attention was fully focused on the people entering and exiting the office building, waiting for Margaret to come down. He had no idea that he was already exposed. Going upstairs was out of the question. Even in the 1940s, security in a business district like this was relatively tight. Without proper preparation, it was difficult to sneak in. So Joe had no choice but to wait in the parking lot. After about half an hour, Margaret finally came downstairs. But she wasn't alone. Leading the way was a sharp, energetic older gentleman, probably in his 50s or 60s. If nothing else, this should be the Uncle John Margaret had mentioned. Margaret followed close behind, but to his surprise, she was also accompanied by a very attentive young man. Behind the three of them were two stern men in long coats, probably bodyguards. Seeing this, Joe quickly and discreetly took out his camera and snapped a few pictures. At this point, Margaret and her companions got into a car. This time, Margaret didn't get into her own car. Instead, she joined Uncle John and the attentive young man in another vehicle. The young man drove while Margaret and Uncle John sat in the back seat. The two bodyguards got into a separate car and followed them. After the cars drove a short distance, Joe started his car and began following them. Josh, who had been watching from a distance, didn't hesitate either. He slowly started his car and followed as well. This was the first time Josh had tried to tail someone, and he wasn't entirely confident. But his focus remained on following Joe and Margaret and avoiding detection by her bodyguards. Fortunately, Joe didn't notice Josh following him from behind. In fact, Josh was lucky. On Tony Windies's orders, Brian of the Irish gang had vouched for him, and part of the $1,000 reward had been used to pay off some of his debts. This had caused the Scappa's men, who had been tailing Joe, to call off their surveillance. If they were still around, Josh, with his limited experience in surveillance, would probably have been discovered much sooner. Josh followed them for most of the day. Margaret and her group first went to a fancy restaurant for lunch. Afterwards, they returned to a jewelry company to conduct business. This went on until about 3 p.m., when the attentive young man finally dropped Margaret off downstairs. After saying goodbye, Margaret got into her own car and drove away. Joe Barbaro, the man who had been following her, persisted in following her, and Josh was no exception. But this time, Margaret seemed to be heading toward Josh's house. Along the way, Joe Barbaro kept a good distance, looking like he was just tailing her. But Josh had no intention of letting Joe off the hook so easily. Although the area was a satellite city, there was still a stretch of uninhabited land between Chicago and Josh's home in Evanston. There were cars on the road, but it was much less crowded than the city. In this deserted area, Josh put on a mask, stepped on the gas, and caught up to Joe Barbaro's car. Timing his move perfectly, he veered left and rammed Joe's car on the driver's side. In both America and China, the driver's seat is on the left, so Josh's maneuver hit Joe Barbaro directly. The impact knocked Joe Barbaro unconscious for a few seconds, and his car lost control, crashing into the farmland on the right side of the road and flipping over. Seeing the success of his move, Josh didn't hesitate to follow him into the field. Since it was late winter, the farmland was just barren ground, and the cold, hard soil made it easy for Josh to drive his car steadily up to Joe Barbaro's overturned vehicle. Joe Barbaro was no fool. Although disoriented from the crash, he still had the sense to reach for the gun hidden under the passenger seat. But before he could grab it, a cold, large barrel of a gun was pressed against the back of his head. Joe Barbaro had no choice but to raise his hands in surrender. "Get out." With a calm but commanding voice, Josh pulled the gun back slightly, but Joe still didn't dare make any sudden moves. Joe was familiar with guns, and from the feel of the gun against his head, he knew that Josh was holding a powerful short-range weapon, a shotgun. At close range, this thing was deadlier than any other weapon. The phrase "within 10 meters, all our gun equal" was no joke. Faced with this, Joe Barbaro abandoned all thoughts of resistance and obediently crawled out of the shattered car window. By now, several cars on the distant highway had noticed the situation. But when they saw Josh, masked and holding a shotgun, they all hit the gas and sped away. As for the police, in this day and age without cell phones or pagers, it would take at least half an hour for them to reach this remote area after being notified. When Joe Barbaro crawled out, he finally saw that the person pointing the gun at him was a tall, thin man wearing a mask. But why did the mask look so familiar? "Is that you?" In the next second, Joe Barbaro recognized the figure, his eyes widening in shock. He couldn't help it. Josh had made a deep impression on him. If Josh hadn't stolen his car, Joe wouldn't be in his current predicament. But what luck to run into that guy again. "I didn't provoke him this time, did I?" Joe thought to himself. "Who told you to follow that woman?" Josh asked coldly, not interested in small talk. Hearing Josh's question, Joe Barbaro finally realized that the task Tony Windies had given him wasn't as easy as he thought. Otherwise, he wouldn't have attracted the attention of this mysterious figure. But what was the connection between this man and the woman he was following? Suddenly, Joe Barbaro remembered seeing a young man in Evanston earlier that morning while he was following Margaret. "Speak. Who told you to follow that woman?" Josh demanded again when he saw Joe Barbaro lost in thought. "It was Mr. Tony Windies. He asked me to follow Mrs. Windies to gather evidence of her affair and to find out the identity of her lover." Faced with the barrel of a gun, Joe Barbaro didn't hesitate to betray his employer. Men like him had no principles. As long as it meant staying alive or making money, they would do anything. But when Joe mentioned the word lover, his tone changed slightly, and his probing look at Josh was noticed by Josh. Had he recognized Josh? Josh frowned. At first he had only wanted to teach this Italian fatso a lesson and find out why Margaret was being followed. He hadn't intended to kill anyone. But if Joe had really recognized him, "This gentleman, Joe Barbaro began, trying to test the waters with Josh. But, bang. A gunshot rang out, echoing across the field. When the police arrived at the car accident scene, it was already half an hour later. Any findings? A burly man in plain clothes got out of the car and asked a police officer in uniform standing nearby. His name was Dietrich, a lieutenant sheriff of the Chicago North District's 3rd Precinct. As a federal country, the United States has never had a unified police rank system since its founding, and it's common to see military ranks used interchangeably with police ranks. The Chicago area isn't as large as it will be in the future, so there are only 13 precincts at present. Dietrich, as the second-in-command of the 3rd Precinct, held an influential position. There are some bloodstains, tire tracks, footprints, and some bloodied bullets, probably deer hunting pellets, but no eggshells, and no sign of the car or the body. What's strange is that although there are traces of 2 cars at the scene, we only found the tire tracks of 1 car leaving. The other car seems to have never existed. The police officer, looking a bit uneasy, reported, "Witnesses." Lieutenant Dietrich asked. We found the person who called in, but they only saw a figure holding a gun from a distance and didn't approach, so they couldn't even tell if the killer was male or female. The officer sighed helplessly. Dietrich nodded, understanding the officer's frustration. Nobody, no weapon, no witnesses, and not even any substantial evidence. In an era with limited investigative tools, this case was basically a cold one. Pack up and go. I'll speak to the chief. After surveying the scene, Dietrich ordered the team to leave. Similar cold cases were too common, and the police didn't want to waste too much energy on them. While the police were reluctantly packing up, having found no leads, Josh, who had changed into new clothes, drove the Lincoln Continental that Margaret had helped him buy and just arrived home. Seeing the Packard parked in front of his house, Josh knew that Margaret was in his home. He had left her a spare key when he moved. How did it go? As Josh got out of the car, Tommy, who happened to be coming out of his house, walked over and asked. A small problem, already solved. Thanks for the help, Josh replied. Of course, he couldn't go into specifics. Tommy, understanding the unspoken rules, didn't ask further. He simply accepted Josh's thanks, nodded, and returned inside. Watching Tommy go inside, Josh sighed lightly. If one paid close attention, they would notice his hands were still trembling slightly. The reason was simple: he had killed someone. It was his first time. The image of a gunshot to the body, the blood and flesh splattering, still lingered in his mind. Even the bloodied body, the shotgun, and the 2 cars involved in the incident were quietly stored in the system's warehouse. There was no supernatural thrill. No overwhelming fear either. Just a sense of nervousness and confusion. Josh still didn't understand why he was so decisive while pulling the trigger and so calm in handling the situation. Josh, where have you been? I've been waiting for you, Margaret's voice interrupted his thoughts as she came out of the door. Seeing him standing there absent-mindedly, she asked with a hint of curiosity. Then, she noticed the strange look Josh gave her. What's wrong? Did my makeup smudge? Margaret asked, feeling a little uncomfortable under Josh's gaze. Before she could say anything else, Josh swiftly picked her up and carried her inside. By the time Margaret came to her senses, she was lying on the bed, naked. T/N, my boy got Riz. Lying in Josh's arms, staring at his youthful, handsome face, Margaret felt something strange and complicated in her heart. But it was also very refreshing. This was something she had never felt with Tony. What happened? Margaret gently stroked Josh's face, asking softly. Your husband sent someone to follow you all day and took a lot of photos, Josh casually replied while caressing Margaret's body. No wonder people say women are the best emotional regulators. After some wild passion, Josh's pent-up negative emotions had been fully released, and he regained his usual calm. He then told Margaret about Tony Windy's sending someone to follow her. Josh didn't have the habit of being an unsung hero. If you make an effort, you should speak up, otherwise, no one will know what you've done. Of course, he left out the fact that he had killed someone, only saying that he had used money to bribe the person following her. What? How dare he? Hearing this, Margaret instantly became angry. Why wouldn't he dare? Not only did he dare send someone to follow you, but he even sent someone to kill you. Otherwise, he'd wait until after the divorce to get kicked out by you, right? Josh said with a hint of mockery, though the mockery was aimed at Tony Windy's, not Margaret. To be fair in this matter, he's quite decisive. If you were dead, your vast fortune would all belong to him. But how did Josh know about Tony Windy's plan? After all, Joe Barbaro had only been carrying out the first step of Tony Windy's tracking plan. The subsequent plans weren't even shared with Joe Barbaro. So, Josh shouldn't have known that Tony Windy's wanted to kill Margaret. Why did Josh say this then? Because, as he was making love with Margaret earlier, Josh finally remembered where the sense of familiarity with her came from when they first met. Margaret, Margot Wundice, a rich girl. Tony Wundice, a tennis star. Wundice is the surname used in the real movie, but in this translation I used Windy's. These were characters from the Hitchcock movie Dial M for Murder. T/N, real movie. Josh knew about this movie because the actress who played Margaret was Grace Kelly. When people think of famous 1950s Hollywood actresses, the first names that come to mind are Audrey Hepburn and Marilyn Monroe. However, in the 1950s, there was an actress who outshone both of them. That actress was Grace Kelly. The reason she's not as famous today as the other two is simple. After achieving fame, she married into the Monaco royal family and became a princess. In the hearts of the people of Monaco, her status was as important as Princess Diana's to the British people. Josh had only watched this movie by chance, so the impression wasn't very deep, which is why he couldn't recall it immediately. But once he remembered, Josh finally realized that he might not have traveled to the original world's World War II era, but rather to a parallel world. And the current situation had a lot of differences from the movie's plot. For example, the movie's story took place in London, not Chicago. Furthermore, an important character was missing, Margaret's lover, Mark. However, thinking about his current relationship with Margaret, it seemed like he had already replaced that guy. Also, the movie's story took place in the early 1950s, which was 10 years later than now. When Margaret heard that Tony Windies wanted to kill her, she was terrified and immediately tried to stand up, but was stopped by Josh. "What are you going to do?" Josh asked. "Of course, I'm going to call the police," Margaret said in a panic. "Call the police? And then what? Tell them your husband is trying to kill you? Do you have any evidence?" Josh rolled his eyes. "But you said he sent someone to follow me and plan my murder, right? That person can testify," Margaret said, regaining some composure. "It's useless. Although I paid him off, he made it very clear that he can't come forward to testify against your husband because he's a member of the mafia. Your husband didn't hire him directly, but hired his boss. Do you understand now?" Josh half lied, half truthfully explained. "Besides, if there's no accident, he's already taken the money I gave him and left Chicago. What should I do then? He surely won't just give up." After hearing Josh's explanation, Margaret realized that calling the police wouldn't do anything to Tony Windies. But as long as they weren't officially divorced, Tony probably wouldn't let her go. No, based on Tony's ruthlessness, even if she successfully divorced him, he would probably still try to get revenge on her. It's simple, strike first, or suffer the consequences later, Josh said softly. "What?" Margaret was shocked by Josh's words. Although the information Josh had revealed made Margaret both hate and fear her husband, the idea of murder was still too distant for her, something she had never considered. But then she thought about it. Perhaps this was actually a very good solution. It must be said that everyone harbors a demon within them. The key is whether anyone releases it. But, what should we do? And this is illegal. Josh, we're still young. If the police find out, it will ruin us. Although Margaret was tempted, as a law-abiding citizen, she still felt fear and resistance towards such a serious crime like murder. "I understand, my dear, but I'm not saying we should do it ourselves. Since he can buy off the mafia, we can do the same. After all, there are countless unsolved cases in the US every year. If we make him disappear quietly, no one will ever know what happened." Josh whispered in her ear like a devil as he held her perfect, tempting body. Although Josh talked about buying the mafia, in his heart, he had already decided to do it himself. Because for Josh, with the advantage of the dimensional trading system, it was much easier to eliminate all traces and evidence by doing it himself than hiring a hitman. In the US, where evidence is the primary basis of law, as long as there is nobody, no weapon, and no complete evidence chain, it's hard to convict someone. Even if someone knows you did it, if you don't admit it, it's difficult to prove your guilt. If this were before today, Josh wouldn't have made such a decision so easily. Clearly, the gunshot Josh fired earlier had opened Pandora's box in his heart. Vigilantes break the law. When a person possesses abilities beyond the ordinary and crosses their moral boundary, it becomes very hard to return to the right path. At this point, it was difficult for Josh to resist any longer. But, even though Josh's words made Margaret waver, it wasn't easy for her to make such a decision. But Josh didn't want to waste more time. He directly silenced all of Margaret's remaining words by giving her a French kiss. Soon, Margaret was completely lost in Josh's youthful, energetic body. The key was that Josh was not only physically young but also skilled. He hadn't wasted the 30-plus years of his past life. Margaret, who seemed mature but lacked much experience, was no match for him. All she could do was feel her mind go blank. That night, Margaret didn't even go home. They were going at it all night. The next morning, Josh and Margaret, like a newlywed couple, happily had breakfast together. If we go with your idea, how much do you think it will cost? And how should we contact someone trustworthy to do this? Margaret asked quietly. It's often said that even heroes can't escape the charm of a beautiful woman. In this case, the reverse was also true. And since women are often more emotional, once they fall in, it's harder for them to get out than for men. Margaret was in that situation. She was already an emotional person, otherwise, she wouldn't have easily fallen for Tony, ignoring her father's strong objections, and married him. If Tony hadn't gone too far over the years, they wouldn't have ended up like this. Now, being with Josh made Margaret feel deeply intoxicated. All she wanted now was to be with him. So Tony Windies became the biggest obstacle in her way. Money won't cost too much. A few thousand, maybe 10,000 at most. As for the person, I believe there are many people in immigrant communities or refugee camps who would be willing. Leave this to me, Josh said without hesitation, taking charge of the whole matter. All right, I'll cover the money. I'll go to the bank later, Margaret nodded. Josh didn't refuse. With Margaret providing the money and Josh handling the work, they were truly in this together. It wasn't that Josh was dark-hearted, but having such a secret bond them was far more stable for their relationship than just emotions or physical attraction alone. After breakfast, they both left the house and headed to the bank. You know what I just remembered? Margaret asked while watching Josh drive. What? Josh asked. Thelma and Louise. Margaret replied. Josh couldn't help but twitch his lips. Although the movie Thelma and Louise hadn't been made yet, it was based on a real-life story from the Great Depression era in the US, and was widely known. There was even a mental disorder named after the two. But the comparison wasn't exactly fortunate. After all, this couple ended up getting shot down. Here's 50,000. Outside the bank, Margaret handed a large brown paper bag to Josh as she got into the car. Hearing the amount, Josh's hand trembled slightly as he almost dropped the bag. He opened it to find 5 stacks of $100 bills. Why so much? Josh asked, slightly confused. Didn't he say 1,000, or at most a few thousand, would be enough? And Margaret, really, aren't you worried about getting robbed? Is it too much? Well, just spend what you need. Keep the extra. A man always needs money for something. It's never a bad thing to have some extra on hand, Margaret said with a kiss on his cheek, speaking warmly. Just that one line nearly broke Josh's resolve. What a wonderful woman. Compared to those who are constantly asking for cars or houses, Josh couldn't help but feel grateful to Tony Windies for causing so much trouble. If it weren't for Tony, a woman like Margaret would never have been available to him. As a return gesture, Josh decided to make Tony Windies' death a painful one to vent Margaret's frustrations. He nodded, accepting the money without any refusal. Margaret was pleased, thinking that Josh had fully accepted her, unlike before when he insisted on paying her. By the way, let's go buy some clothes. Your wardrobe needs an upgrade. Those clothes are no match for your handsome face. Oh, and we need to get you new shoes too. Margaret excitedly linked her arm with Josh's. All right, I'll go with whatever you choose. Josh nodded. He didn't care much about clothes, but he couldn't bring himself to refuse this sweet and charming lady. But I don't have any clothing vouchers left, Josh said. Just like sugar and gasoline, even in America at that time, clothes and shoes had to be bought with specific clothing coupons. Since 1942, every federal citizen received 24 clothing vouchers per year to purchase clothes and shoes. It may sound like a lot, but one clothing voucher didn't get you very far. For example, a coat required 18 vouchers, a full suit 26 vouchers, a pair of shoes 9 vouchers, slippers 5 vouchers, a slip, undergarment dress 3 vouchers, pants 8 vouchers, a bra 3 vouchers, and so on. In other words, 24 clothing vouchers weren't enough to buy a complete outfit from head to toe. Shoes were even more strictly controlled and could only be bought twice a year per person. If you wanted more, you had to buy second-hand. Some things, like stockings, were even harder to find. Yes, stockings. A somewhat amusing fact for later generations is that during World War II, stockings were considered as crucial as sugar and gasoline. Why? Because of parachutes. Before the war, the primary material for American parachutes was not nylon, but silk, which came from Asia. But after the war with Japan, the silk supply was cut off, so parachutes were made from nylon. This led to all nylon manufacturers, including DuPont, being forced by the federal government to stop making stockings and other nylon products, focusing solely on military supplies like parachutes. From then on, civilian stockings became scarce, and their prices skyrocketed, reaching up to $20 a pair during the war. At the peak of the war, the price even hit an astounding $4,000. This was a price that even 21st century celebrities wouldn't dare ask for. Still, the demand for nylon remained high. So the military launched a campaign to solicit donations from civilians, even advertising with photos of handsome soldiers to encourage women to give up their stockings. It was absurd. What was even more absurd, according to an FBI report, during the war, the most commonly stolen items from American homes weren't dollars, gold, or valuables, but alcohol, stockings, and shoes. This was why Josh had been wearing an ill-fitting coat, as it was a piece left by his father. Even when he stole or borrowed cars, and when he tracked and killed Joe Barbaro, most of the clothes he wore were old clothes, so he didn't mind burning them. He had only recently bought a few new sets when he had some money to spare, using up all the clothing vouchers from the past 2 years. Josh's gaze shifted to Margaret's smooth thigh, and he couldn't resist running his hand over it. Margaret had been wearing stockings yesterday, but he had torn them off in the heat of the moment, and now he felt a twinge of regret. "This place is crowded. Don't make a scene." "Don't worry about the vouchers, we won't need them," Margaret said, then leaned in close to Josh's ear and whispered, "But if you really can't wait, we can find a more private spot." Her soft whisper sent a shiver down Josh's spine. This woman really knew how to tempt him. He shook his head, reminding himself that he was still growing and shouldn't overdo it. So, he ignored Margaret's suggestion and drove the car toward the destination she had given. When they arrived, Josh found that the place Margaret mentioned wasn't a regular shopping mall. It was a high-end bespoke tailor shop, the kind Josh had only heard about in his previous life. But during this time, bespoke shops weren't as pretentious as they would later become, and ready-made clothes were still available. After some work from the tailor, Margaret helped Josh pick out 3 suits, and they also ordered 3 custom-made ones. In the end, they didn't use vouchers but instead paid with thick stacks of cash. Of course, Margaret's social connections as a Chicago socialite played a part in this. So-called material shortages and limited supplies mostly applied to ordinary citizens with no power. After buying the clothes, they went to a shoe store, where the same transaction took place. They also visited a watch shop, where they spent thousands on a Breguet watch. Although Breguet's fame had been overshadowed by brands like Patek Philippe and Vacheron Constantin in later years, during this period, Breguet was the unrivaled king of watches. And now, Breguet not only made watches and aviation instruments, but even built fighter jets. After all the shopping and fitting, Josh looked completely refreshed, with a sharp new look that complemented his handsome face and tall figure. With the confidence of someone who had traveled from another time, his entire aura seemed elevated. From a regular handsome guy, he had transformed into a modern-day aristocrat. As the saying goes, clothes mocketh the man. The ancient wisdom was right. It was another night, and Tony Windies found himself at the chicken farm once again. "Any news about Joe?" Tony Windies asked the doorman. "No, sir. He hasn't come by since that day," the doorman replied with a shake of his head. He then added, "Looking for Mary and Nancy again tonight?" Hearing that Joe was still a no-show, Tony Windies frowned. He had made plans with Joe, and the first step of their work was supposed to be completed within 3 days. But now it was already the 4th day, and there was still no sign of him. Could that guy have run off? It didn't seem likely. While Tony had already handed over some money, $200 for expenses and another $1,000 to the Moretti family Scappa, the full payment had yet to be given. There was no way Joe would flee halfway through. Unless something had gone wrong? Thinking about his wife's recent behavior, Tony noted that apart from one night when she stayed out and refused to let him into the bedroom, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. In fact, she appeared less angry lately and hadn't brought up divorce again. That was a good sign. It meant he didn't need to act in haste. "Sir? Shall I call Mary and Nancy for you?" The doorman's reminder pulled Tony Windies out of his thoughts. "Oh, not now. Is Brian here?" Tony waved his hand dismissively. "Brian's in the back," the doorman replied. "Prepare the usual private room for me. Get me a bottle of whiskey and ask Brian to come over," Tony instructed, handing over a $10 tip. Of course, right away. The doorman happily obliged. While this chicken farm was Chicago's largest, generous customers like Tony Windy's were rare. T/N, chicken farm is an alternative word for brothels. Soon in the private room, Tony was joined by Brian, a burly Irishman with a somewhat fierce expression. "Good evening, Tony, my friend. You called for me." Brian greeted him with a wide grin. "Who's your friend?" "You wish." "Yes, Mr. Brian. Do you remember that Joe Barbaro you met a few days ago?" Tony asked, suppressing his disdain. "Oh, of course, that smelly little Italian fatty. You even vouched for him. What's up? Did he mess things up? I told you, if you need something done, come to me. Those Italians are unreliable." Brian's voice was loud, and his words were filled with contempt for Italians. "Maybe you're right. But this matter can't be left unresolved. He's gone missing, and I need you to find him. Consider this your fee." Tony placed an envelope on the table, forcing a calm demeanor despite his disgust. As a true Englishman, Tony disliked Italians, but he loathed the Irish even more. Equality? That was just a slogan. This country had never truly known equality. The English looked down on the Irish. The Germans looked down on the French. The French looked down on the Italians. Everyone looked down on someone. And all whites collectively discriminated against people of color. Ha ha ha. "Mr. Windy's, you're too kind. I'll make arrangements immediately. Once I find that fatty, I'll deliver him to you," Brian said, taking the envelope. After checking its contents, his smile grew even broader, though the scars on his face made his expression more menacing. "Go." Tony waved him off impatiently. Brian didn't mind. People like him grew up in environments filled with discrimination, so small acts of disrespect didn't bother them, as long as they got paid. Once Brian left, Tony finally called for the two women and indulged himself until the early morning hours. He didn't stay the night, though he could have. As a somewhat prominent figure, it wouldn't look good if he were seen leaving during the day. Unknown to him, his predictable movements played right into the hands of Josh, who had been tailing him for 2 days. Unlike his last target, Joe Barbaro, Tony hadn't shown any intention of leaving the city. Margaret's estate was in the quiet north side, which was still part of Chicago, unlike Evanston, which required traversing desolate outskirts. Moreover, as a wealthy area, police patrols were frequent. Any action taken during normal hours would risk detection, making a clean getaway difficult. But early morning was different. At that hour, with the cold biting hard, unless there was an emergency, nobody, including the underpaid Chicago police, would venture out to freeze themselves. In Chicago, the wee hours were dominated by organized crime groups, be it the Italian mafia or other gangs. Tony Windy's, as drunk as a skunk, had no idea he was being followed. The doorman noticed a car trailing Tony but thought little of it. Coincidences happen. In his line of work, it was best not to meddle. Curiosity often ended with a swim in Lake Michigan. As Josh trailed Tony's car, he waited for the perfect spot to strike, a deserted park ahead. But before they got there, something unexpected happened. At an intersection, Josh watched as Tony's car swerved and crashed into a parked vehicle. Josh. See? That's what happens when you drink and drive. Of course, the DUI laws wouldn't exist until the 1970s, so technically, Tony wasn't breaking any rules. This crash, however, thwarted Josh's plans, until he noticed something in his rearview mirror. 4 men in shabby suits emerged from the parked car, swearing loudly. Clearly, they weren't there by accident but had been staking out the area. Josh quickly pieced it together. At this hour, parked and waiting, they were likely planning something illegal. He parked his car at a nearby corner, donned a mask and gloves, and stashed his vehicle in his system storage before quietly coming back. By the time he returned, Tony had been dragged out of his car and was being beaten mercilessly on the roadside. After venting their anger, the 4 men rifled through Tony's belongings, taking his wallet and watch, before returning to their car. But when they tried to start it, the car wouldn't budge. Furious, they turned their attention to Tony's car, only to find it unusable too. Enraged, they gave Tony another beating before retrieving some items, guns, from their trunk. Looking around, Josh spotted a high-end jewelry store nearby. Ah, so that's the target. Tony's luck couldn't have been worse. These men had been planning a heist, only to have him ruin it. With their getaway vehicle out of commission, the gang had no choice but to abandon their plan. Once the men left, and the street was deserted, Josh approached the battered Tony. Though unconscious, Tony was still breathing. Without hesitation, Josh grabbed Tony's head and smashed it against the ground. The sound of his skull hitting the pavement echoed through the cold, quiet night. With that, Josh walked away, leaving the scene. Once far enough, he retrieved his car and disappeared into the darkness. While Tony's disappearance wasn't complete, Josh doubted the police could trace anything back to him. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no weapon, and no evidence. This wasn't a solvable case, especially in 1940 Chicago. The four men, with their criminal intentions, were perfect scapegoats. Later, Margaret could apply pressure as a grieving widow, ensuring the case quietly closed. Josh couldn't help but reflect. Never drink and drive. It had saved him a lot of trouble this time. Ring. Ring. The shrill sound of the phone jolted Margaret from her sleep. She turned on the bedside lamp and glanced at the clock. 3 a.m.? Who would call at this hour? Her confusion didn't last long. Margaret quickly remembered her beloved sweetheart. Without hesitation, she picked up the phone. Hello. Margaret greeted tentatively. It's me, Margaret, came Josh's voice on the other end. Josh, why are you calling so late? Is there any news about the matter? Margaret's voice trembled slightly as she confirmed that it was him. Yes, there is news. But it has nothing to do with us, Josh replied, his tone strange, though Margaret didn't notice. I see, it has nothing to do with us. Margaret took a deep breath and replied. No, Margaret, I mean it literally. Tony Windies is dead, but it wasn't our doing. Josh clarified bluntly and recounted the incident. Of course, he carefully left out the part where he had lent a hand. As long as that detail remained hidden, even if the call was monitored, Tony Windies' death wouldn't implicate Josh. The police would easily conclude that Tony was driving drunk, crashed into another car, got into a conflict, and was accidentally killed. Upon hearing Josh's explanation, Margaret was stunned for a moment, but soon joy overwhelmed her. Although she had decided to get rid of Tony, as a former good girl she couldn't help but feel uneasy about it. But now Tony was dead, and it had nothing to do with her. This realization lifted an immense weight from her chest. Josh, I miss you. A delighted Margaret began to talk sweetly on the phone, completely ignoring the fact that the deceased was her husband. Baby, I miss you too, but now is not the time. I suspect the police will visit you in the morning. When they do, put some pressure on them to wrap up this case quickly. Once it's closed, we can be together openly, Josh comforted her over the phone. Margaret agreed. The two exchanged sweet talk for a while before reluctantly ending the call. After hanging up, Margaret, still intoxicated, didn't feel like going back to sleep. She happily opened a bottle of champagne. Sipping alone, Margaret suddenly remembered something. Her late husband had taken out several insurance policies as a tennis player. Now that he was dead, wouldn't she receive a substantial payout? Previously, Margaret hadn't considered this because Josh had planned to make Tony disappear. And with mere disappearances, insurance companies could deny claims because there was no proof of death. But now, if Tony was officially declared an accidental death, and the policy didn't have a third-party exclusion clause, the insurance company would have to pay the full amount. A third-party exclusion clause in a contract prevents parties from being held liable for any issues that arise from information shared by a third party. This clause is used to protect parties from being responsible for information that they did not create or endorse. The policies had hefty premiums, Margaret had paid for them, and of course, she was the beneficiary. How much was the payout? A few million, perhaps? What a windfall. With Tony dead, Margaret's net worth could double overnight. What a good man. Thinking about it, Margaret couldn't help but share Josh's sentiment. There were so many good people in this world. Her hatred for Tony Windies completely vanished. As a gesture of gratitude, she decided to give him an elaborate funeral. After all, with all those millions, it wouldn't be fair to skimp. Morning came quickly. As Josh had predicted, Margaret was enjoying her morning tea around 8 a.m. when the police arrived. Leading them was none other than Lieutenant Dietrich, who had handled Josh's earlier case. Although Tony had died outside Dietrich's jurisdiction, the victim lived within it. And yes, there was no doubt, Tony Windies was dead. He'd been discovered by a passerby about 5 a.m. due to the low temperatures, His body had already begun to stiffen. The police found numerous bruises on Tony's body, evidence of a severe beating. But the cause of death was a severe blow to the back of the head. "Good morning, Lieutenant. What brings you in so early?" Margaret asked as she ordered a servant to prepare coffee. "I'm sorry to disturb you so early, Mrs. Wendice, but I regret to inform you that your husband has passed away," Dietrich said. "What? My husband is dead? What happened?" Margaret feigned surprise and showed no sign of grief, for she was not grieving. Pretending to be sad would have been unnecessary, even suspicious, since the police would easily discover the couple's strained relationship. "Mrs. Wendice, your relationship with Mr. Wendice seems to have been less than harmonious," Dietrich inquired. What reason could there be for an unemployed husband to stay out all night?" Margaret replied calmly. Dietrich suddenly felt he'd asked a silly question. According to the investigation, Tony had spent the night before his death in a questionable establishment. To neglect a beautiful, youthful wife like Margaret, to frequent such places? No one would believe that the couple had a happy marriage. As Josh had expected, Dietrich had no suspicion on Margaret. The crime scene clearly indicated that Tony Wendice had been beaten to death after a drunken car accident. Several suspects were involved. Moreover, evidence at the scene, including the damaged car, had already led the police to link the case to a notorious gang of jewel thieves, none other than the four suited men Josh had seen. Coincidentally, this gang wasn't just dirty. They were linked to several robberies and a murder in the past few months. And the officer in charge of the case? Lieutenant Dietrich. To Josh and Margaret, this was just another group of good people. In fact, there were so many good people. Tony Wendice's funeral was held 3 days after his death, at the renowned Rose Hill Cemetery in Chicago's northern suburbs. Although Tony didn't have many close relatives, the funeral was well attended. As a former tennis star, albeit a second-rate one, he still had a certain level of recognition. However, Josh didn't join the crowd. Others might not know the truth, but he was fully aware of how Tony had met his end. Pretending to mourn someone you had a hand in killing felt too hypocritical. Instead, Josh stayed in a parked car at a distance, playing the role of Margaret's driver. After more than 2 hours of mingling and seeing off guests, Margaret finally returned to the car and got into the back seat. "How are you feeling? Tired?" Josh asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. Margaret, dressed in a conservative black dress, wore a small veiled hat adorned with a black ribbon. A delicate pearl choker graced her neck, and sheer black stockings completed her ensemble. Her appearance was refined and elegant, exuding an air of mystery. "I'm fine. Everything was handled by the pastor and the funeral home. All I did was show up, so there wasn't much to tire me out," Margaret replied, shaking her head lightly. "By the way, what's with that guy?" Josh asked, nodding toward a young man lingering nearby, stealing glances in their direction. The man had also attended the funeral and had been trying to get close to Margaret since the beginning of the service. Josh had noticed him before. He had first seen the man when Joe Barbaro was tailing Margaret to a jewelry company. The man, David Leibler, appeared to be connected to the Uncle John Margaret had mentioned and had been openly flirting with her that day as well. Him? That's David Leibler, Uncle John's second son. He's a notorious playboy. He used to manage their family's business in New York, but returned recently. When we ran into each other at Uncle John's office a while back, he found out I was preparing for a divorce and wouldn't stop pestering me. I thought I made it clear last time, but he still hasn't given up, Margaret said, frowning in irritation. Margaret genuinely disliked David, seeing him as no better than her late husband. Despite being in his early 30s, David had already been divorced twice, both times due to his womanizing and reckless lifestyle. If Tony had been somewhat discreet because of his public image as an athlete, David was shamelessly indulgent, flaunting his flings without care. With Tony serving as experience, Margaret had no interest in entertaining someone like David. "Want me to teach him a lesson?" Josh offered, narrowing his eyes. It was bad enough that Margaret had just become his golden ticket, and now someone was already trying to poach her? Josh could barely contain his anger. Maybe he should send David to keep Tony company. Forget it. Just stay away from him. Uncle John has been good to me, and I don't want to strain that relationship, Margaret replied quickly, halting Josh's dangerous thoughts. Margaret had come to understand that beneath Josh's seemingly harmless exterior lay a dangerous, wolfish nature. Yet this bad boy charm only deepened her infatuation with him. Even so, she didn't want Josh handling David. While she didn't care about Tony's fate, she did care about Uncle John. She couldn't bear the thought of the kind old man suffering the loss of his son because of her. Josh, though annoyed, respected Margaret's wishes and started the car, driving away from the cemetery. Out of sight, out of mind. As a time traveler, Josh hadn't felt much connection to this era. But with Margaret, a woman who had wholeheartedly devoted herself to him, his perspective had shifted. Others might not matter to him, but Margaret's emotions did. Rather than returning to the estate Margaret had once shared with Tony, they went back to their home in Evanston. The estate no longer held any sentimental value for Margaret. In fact, it reminded her of everything she despised about Tony. She had moved to Evanston with Josh, bringing along a few loyal servants. Their house in Evanston was spacious, boasting 8 bedrooms, more than enough for everyone. When they arrived, Margaret greeted their neighbors, Tommy's family, who were enjoying afternoon tea in their yard. Once inside, Josh wasted no time pulling Margaret into his arms. "Wait, let me change first." Margaret protested playfully, swatting his wandering hands away. "No need. I love you in this outfit," Josh murmured, holding her firmly and leaning close to her ear. Feeling his warm breath on her neck, Margaret melted into his embrace. With no further resistance, Josh scooped her up effortlessly, carrying her upstairs amid her surprised squeals. Moments later, her soft murmurs filled the house. Downstairs, the staff heard the sounds and couldn't help but smile, thinking, youth is a beautiful thing. But while Margaret and Josh celebrated their new life together, in another corner of the city, a very different scene unfolded. Inside a dimly lit tavern, a group of 4 men sat in dejected silence. They were the same criminals who had planned to rob a jewelry store, only for their plans to be derailed by Tony Windies's drunken interference. Now, they had an unexpected murder charge hanging over their heads. It was hard to imagine anyone in their shoes feeling the least bit cheerful. Out in the western suburbs of Chicago, inside a small bar with a closed sign hanging outside, the interior was filled with smoke and gloom. A bartender and 4 men in suits were quietly drinking, their cigarettes adding to the haze. Who knew that drunk bastard would be so fragile? Now look at us. Not only did he die on us, but he also ruined our plans and made the cops tighten their grip. Damn it. Goss, pour me another, one of the suited men cursed, slamming his empty whiskey glass onto the counter. These 4 men were the unlucky group whose heist at the jewelry store had been derailed by Tony Windies's drunken intrusion. Unbeknownst to them, Tony's death was actually caused by Josh finishing the job later. The group genuinely believed they had accidentally beaten him to death that night. "You've already drunk 2 bottles of my good stuff. Do you even know how rare real Kentucky bourbon is these days?" Goss, the bartender and owner of the bar, retorted irritably. Besides running the bar, Goss also handled logistics for the group, securing weapons, cars, and fences for their loot. 2 bottles? Come on, Goss, it's just whiskey. The man snapped, clearly annoyed. Just whiskey. You've got some nerve saying that. Take a look around, Cody. It's not like 2 years ago anymore. A bottle of this stuff goes for $200 now, if you can even find one. Goss grumbled, pouring another glass for himself. Though Prohibition had long ended, the war had driven alcohol prices sky-high again. Official whiskey distilleries were barely producing for civilians, as most supplies were requisitioned by the military. A single bottle of legitimate bourbon could fetch a fortune, with black market prices starting at $200. Of course, cheaper options existed. Moonshine from makeshift distilleries could go for as little as $10 a bottle. But the quality was questionable, and the risk of poisoning was ever present. Who cares? We made a killing last time, didn't we? Cody argued, shrugging off Goss's complaints. For someone in their line of work, living large was part of the deal. Made a killing? Really? Sure, you hit a couple of jewelry stores, but let's be honest, how much of it was actually worth anything? Even the gold was just 18-karat junk. You barely got any platinum, and most of the stuff was silver. Altogether, the haul might be worth 10 grand tops. And even if you could sell it all, you'd be lucky to pocket 2 grand each after cuts, Goss shot back, his frustration spilling out. The truth was, the team had been targeting low-tier jewelry stores that only stocked entry-level goods. Their loot, while plentiful, lacked real value. Even after fencing the goods, they were left with scraps compared to their expectations. Cody fell silent, clearly aware that Goss's assessment was spot on. "All right, fine. Goss, crack open another bottle." "It's on me," Lewis, the de facto leader of the group, interjected. Goss raised an eyebrow but complied, pulling out another of his dwindling bourbon reserves. "Thanks, boss." Cody grinned, eagerly pouring drinks for everyone, himself included. "This stuff won't last forever. Soon enough, I'll be stuck selling bathtub gin," Goss muttered. "Don't worry, Goss. Things will turn around," Lewis assured him, raising his glass. Then he turned to his crew. "Frank, Dix, stay sharp. Once the heat dies down, we'll hit something bigger." "I'm with you, Lewis," grunted Dix, the largest and quietest of the group. But Frank, the youngest member, hesitated. After a moment, he spoke softly. "I think I'm done, Lewis. I want out." The bar fell silent. "Done? Why?" Cody blurted out, his voice laced with irritation. "You're just gonna quit because of a little heat? You're betraying us." "Cody, shut it." Lewis snapped before turning to Frank. "What's going on, kid?" "It's Marcy. She doesn't want me mixed up in this anymore," Frank admitted hesitantly, referring to his childhood sweetheart. "Marcy? Again with her? Why let some farm girl tell you what to do? Look at Vanna. She knows better than to meddle in my business." Cody scoffed. "Cody!" Lewis shouted, silencing him. "All right, Frank. If that's what you've decided, I won't stop you. But you know the rules. First, you forfeit half your cut. Second, if you ever sell us out, there will be consequences," Lewis said firmly, though his tone was understanding. "Understood." "Thank you, Lewis," Frank said gratefully. Just then, a knock came at the door. Everyone froze, their hands inching toward concealed weapons. Goss gestured for calm and peered through the peephole. After a moment, he relaxed. "It's Corby," he announced. Hearing the name, the tension in the room eased. Corby was a well-known fixer in the area, a middleman for jobs, fencing, loans, and underground gambling. Corby stepped inside, glancing around. "Lewis, someone wants to meet you," he said directly without beating around the bush. "Who?" Lewis asked, narrowing his eyes. "Dr. Schneider. Erwin Lyndon Schneider. Ever heard of him?" Corby replied. Lewis's eyes widened. "Schneider? The Schneider from Philly." The room fell silent once more, but this time, the tension was different. A name like Schneider carried weight, and whatever he wanted, it was bound to be big. Josh neither knew nor cared about the unfortunate situation of those good men who had taken the fall for him. As long as his own life was going well, that was all that mattered. Each day he would sleep in until late in the morning, then spend his free time with Margaret, riding horses on a country farm, basking in the sun, or enjoying pastimes like golf or bowling. Occasionally, they would take a boat ride on Lake Michigan, see a play or a movie at the theater. They seemed like a honeymooning couple, completely inseparable because of their rich and varied entertainment. But in the midst of spending so much time with Margaret, Josh didn't neglect his business, his interdimensional smuggling operation with Daenerys. Though he spent most of his days glued to Margaret's side, he still found time here and there to visit Chicago's various gun shops, bookstores, and black markets to acquire items Daenerys had requested. Every night at 7 p.m., regardless of his other activities, Josh would lock himself in his study for about half an hour to stay in touch with Daenerys and maintain their partnership. Margaret, though a bit curious about Josh's peculiar habit of locking himself away every night, never poked her head into it. She understood the importance of giving her partner personal space. In addition, Josh still maintained his lifestyle from his previous life. No smoking, no excessive drinking, no gambling, and no visits to questionable establishments, not that he had the opportunity. To Margaret, a man with such healthy habits was a rare treasure. She adored him and didn't see his occasional aloofness as a flaw, quite the opposite. In fact, she found his protectiveness quite charming. With so many positives, why fuss over such a small, inconsequential issue? That night at 7 p.m., Josh greeted Daenerys through the screen. She was dressed in an elegant, court-style gown. "I have some new items for you, Daenerys," Josh said. The gown Josh had sent her as a gift was an Elizabethan-style masterpiece, one Josh had commissioned at great expense. To be clear, this was Queen Elizabeth I, not the future monarch, Queen Elizabeth II. After all, in 1943, the reigning British monarch was the stuttering King George VI, while the future queen was just an 18-year-old princess. Daenerys' current attire, while considered luxurious in her world, would seem modest by 20th-century American standards or even by the grandeur of 15th and 16th-century European aristocratic fashion. Still, the dress had captured Daenerys' heart. After all, no woman can resist looking beautiful, especially a queen who must maintain her regal presence in public. "What is it this time?" Daenerys asked curiously. "This," Josh replied as he initiated a transaction. After confirming the exchange, Daenerys discovered a collection of exquisite jewelry and tableware. Her eyes lit up as she examined the items, much like the dress Josh had sent her earlier. The craftsmanship of the jewelry and tableware was breathtaking. Though Daenerys was no stranger to wealth, the artistry behind these items left her speechless. In terms of sheer wealth, Josh couldn't compare to Daenerys. Her treasury far exceeded his. But wealth of raw materials isn't everything. Craftsmanship can transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. The pieces Josh sent featured intricate designs and delicate details, a stark contrast to the more crude styles of Westerosi jewelry. While handcrafted pieces have a unique charm, technological advances greatly enhance the result. For example, diamonds, though abundant, were difficult to cut properly in pre-modern times due to their hardness and brittleness. One false move and a large, valuable diamond could shatter. Then there were materials like aluminum. In modern times, it's common and inexpensive. But in Daenerys' world, where there were no mining processes, aluminum was practically unheard of as a mythical metal. Josh had sent her a set of aluminum jewelry set with small diamonds, along with aluminum tableware. These items, worth little in 20th century America, would be considered priceless treasures in Daenerys' world worthy of any royal collection. Such exquisite jewelry. What is this material? I thought it was silver at first, but it's so light. Daenerys exclaimed as she admired the pieces. It's aluminum, Josh explained. In my world, it's an abundant metal, but its extraction requires special techniques. In your world, producing even small amounts would be nearly impossible, unless your dragons could help, but even then the yield would be minimal. Daenerys quickly understood the implications. Interesting. I see what you're getting at, she said with a smile. That's a very intriguing idea, Josh. But tell me, is there nothing else you're after besides gold? At this rate, you're going to empty my treasury of all its gold. Josh chuckled. Your Majesty, I'm sure your treasury is far from empty, especially with the items I'm providing. But speaking of which, I have a new idea for our transactions. Let's hear it, Daenerys replied. Raw materials, Josh said. In the bedroom, Margaret, dressed casually in a silk robe, was leaning against the bed's headboard, absorbed in a book. Margaret wasn't exactly a literature freak, so the book she was reading wasn't some profound essay or poetry collection, but rather an ordinary, popular novel. She was so engrossed that she didn't notice that Josh had spent a little longer than usual in the study that evening. It wasn't until Josh opened the door that she looked up, startled. However, she immediately saw Josh carefully closing and locking the door before mysteriously approaching the window. What's going on, honey? Margaret asked curiously. Nothing much. I just came by to give you a gift, Josh said, feigning mystery. A gift? Let me guess, jewelry. Margaret said with surprise, followed by excitement. Oh dear, you guessed right. Josh exclaimed, genuinely surprised at how accurate her guess was. Is it really jewelry? That's wonderful. Let me see. Margaret said, excited and full of anticipation. Josh could tell, however, that while Margaret was genuinely excited, her level of anticipation wasn't particularly high. This was understandable. As a wealthy woman whose father had once been a major jeweler, Margaret had seen and handled countless pieces of high-end jewelry. Aside from the large diamond rings she had already put away, Josh had seen her other jewelry, each a collectible masterpiece. So it was unrealistic to expect her to be overly enthusiastic about typical jewelry. That was also why, despite knowing Margaret for so long and becoming so close, Josh had rarely given her a formal gift. He simply didn't have anything impressive enough. On the other hand, Margaret showered Josh with gifts all the time. From cars to houses, from clothes to accessories. She even seemed willing to give Josh her vast fortune all at once. There was a natural disparity in their initial financial positions. So Margaret's anticipation was less about the value of the gift and more about it being Josh's first formal gift to her. Realizing this, Josh felt even more indebted to her and found himself appreciating this woman even more. As it turned out, Margaret's assumptions were wrong today. The jewelry Josh was about to present to her was, in fact, far more precious than she could have imagined. Not just precious, absolutely unique in the world. Without deliberately heightening Margaret's curiosity for fear of overwhelming her, Josh simply reached into his coat and pulled out the gift. The moment Josh revealed it, Margaret froze. Her eyes widened as she clasped her hands tightly over her mouth, her gaze fixed on the dazzling brilliance of the crystal under the dim table lamp. The gift Josh was presenting was both ordinary and extraordinary. It was ordinary in that it was a diamond. Thanks to her upbringing and her father's jewelry business, Margaret quickly recognized it as a real diamond, an incredibly rare pink diamond, no less. But an ordinary pink diamond wasn't enough to leave Margaret speechless. What really shocked her was the extraordinary size of this diamond. Pigeon egg was often used as a term for large diamonds, but had she ever seen one the size of a chicken egg? And a pink one at that. Until today, the largest diamond Margaret knew of was the famous Cullinan diamond, discovered in South Africa in 1905 and presented to the British royal family. How big was it? About the size of an adult woman's palm. It was 10 centimeters long, 6.5 centimeters wide, and 5 centimeters high, and weighed 3,106 carats. It was transparent with a faint blue tint and was graded FL, flawless, the highest grade. However, in 1908, this diamond had been cut into 9 large pieces and 96 smaller ones. In comparison, the diamond before Margaret was smaller, but still amazing. It was much larger than the second largest Kohinoor, with a slightly lower clarity rating of IF, internally flawless, the second highest grade, but weighed well over 1,000 carats. And it was a pink diamond. A pink diamond. A pink diamond. Important things are worth repeating. Let's not dismiss diamonds as a scam. In the 21st century, diamonds have become something of a scam due to their abundance and the rise of synthetic diamonds. But in 1943, things were different. Although diamonds were abundant around the world, only a fraction, those of gem quality, were considered valuable. Within that fraction, diamonds that met the highest 4C standards, carat, clarity, color, cut, were extremely rare. This rarity justified their value in the marketplace. Synthetic diamonds didn't become a factor until the 1970s, and even then, gem-quality synthetic diamonds didn't appear until around 2000. In this era, the diamond Josh held in his hand was a real, unique treasure. Is this really for me? Where did you get it? Does anyone else know about it? Margaret asked in a soft, trembling voice. Despite her excitement, Margaret couldn't ignore the implications. The value of such a treasure was the least of her worries. The real danger was that its existence would become known. Margaret feared that she and Josh might one day meet a tragic end because of it. Such a treasure could cause a worldwide frenzy. Without the power of the pre-World War I British Empire, no one could protect it. Even the British royal family had chosen to cut the Cullinan diamond, not because they didn't know that bigger was better, but because they feared it would attract too much attention. Margaret wasn't sure if Josh was showing her his deep love or setting her up for trouble. Fortunately, there was a way to mitigate the risk. As the British royal family had done, the diamond could be cut. And that was exactly what Josh had in mind when he gave the diamond to Margaret. She had learned to cut diamonds from her jeweler father, though she had only ever worked with smaller stones. But this was in a league of its own. My dear, I understand your concerns. Rest assured, as long as you don't reveal anything, the existence of this diamond will remain known only to the two of us. Josh explained with a reassuring smile in response to Margaret's worries. After all, this gem had been sitting in the treasure vault of the Dragon Queen Daenerys, in another world just 10 minutes ago. There was no way anyone in this world could have seen it before. The aluminum jewelry and finely cut diamond pieces Josh had previously gifted to Daenerys had inspired her with a lucrative new business venture. In return, she provided Josh with a vast collection of jewels, primarily raw diamonds. As on Earth, diamonds were classified as gemstones in Westeros, but weren't particularly popular. The reason wasn't their abundance, but the sheer difficulty of polishing diamonds with ancient technology. It made mass production impossible, though diamonds were easily used for cutting metals. However, this pink diamond had not initially been part of Daenerys' trade offerings. Such an exceptional stone, despite its challenging craftsmanship, was among the finest treasures in Westeros. Its soft pink hue was one of Daenerys' favorites, so it had been locked away in her private vault of prized possessions. But Daenerys had made the mistake of promising Josh he could choose one item from her vault. And that was that. By now, Daenerys was probably sulking in a corner of her palace, drawing angry circles on the floor. "Are you sure?" Margaret's doubt only deepened at Josh's explanation. How could such a priceless diamond exist with only the two of them knowing about it? "Trust me, nothing will happen. Look at how perfectly it suits you," Josh said, holding the diamond against Margaret's ample chest. At that moment, Josh's eyes were glued to the sight. The pink diamond, glowing under the dim yellow bedside lamp, cast a radiant glow on Margaret's fair skin, creating a scene of unparalleled beauty. Margaret, startled by Josh's sudden and fiery gaze, barely had time to let out a small cry before being pushed down onto the bed. Diamond? To hell with the diamond. As the mattress springs endured the strain of their movements, the once admired pink diamond was gradually pushed closer to the edge of the bed by the bouncing. Finally, with a soft thud, it fell to the floor, landing safely on the wooden planks below. It was fortunate the floor was wood. Had it been tiled, this precious gem might have met its untimely demise less than 30 minutes after arriving in this world. "You want to start a sugar factory, an aluminum alloy plant, and a craft goods company?" Margaret asked as she toyed with the diamond in her hands, still basking in the afterglow of their recent activities. The alloy plant and craft goods factory seemed doable, but a sugar factory? Isn't it hard to source raw materials these days? Margaret didn't object to Josh's business plans in the slightest. After all, the factories he wanted to set up weren't large-scale and wouldn't require much money, likely just tens of thousands. That was a drop in the bucket for Margaret, who had recently received a substantial insurance payout following Tony Wendy's death. In fact, if Josh wanted more money, she'd gladly provide it. Even if he lost every cent, she wouldn't mind. Especially after receiving the diamond Josh had just gifted her. Even if it were cut into smaller pieces and sold, its value would far exceed her current net worth. But, as she had pointed out, the sugar factory posed a problem. Starting an aluminum alloy plant or a craft goods factory was relatively straightforward. Despite wartime economic conditions, aluminum, a key material for aviation, was not entirely restricted in the US because the country imported most of its bauxite from Brazil, which was unaffected by the war. While aluminum products were rationed, raw materials were not, and the government would even encourage such production. Any output would likely be purchased by the military, ensuring no losses. The craft goods factory, focusing on items like glassware and inexpensive diamond crafts, wasn't tied to the war effort and posed no issues. The sugar factory, however, was a different story. At this time, sugar production primarily relied on sugarcane and sugar beets. Corn syrup and fructose, though known, had limited production due to underdeveloped technology, making them more expensive than regular sugar. Additionally, sugarcane and sugar beets were seasonal crops. With Pacific trade routes disrupted by the war, Southeast Asian sugarcane imports had stopped. Domestic supplies were allocated to large companies, leaving smaller factories like Josh's without raw materials unless he had connections. What Margaret didn't know was that Josh never intended to source raw materials from this world. His supply would come from Westeros. Daenerys' interest in sugar wasn't because Westeros lacked it entirely, but because the continent didn't have refined sugar production technology. Josh could import raw sugar from Westeros, refine it here, and sell it back to Daenerys, or on the domestic market, for enormous profits. This plan wasn't without risks. If the US government discovered the anomaly of producing large quantities of sugar without raw materials, questions would arise. But Josh's ultimate goal wasn't even traditional sugar. He was focused on introducing something revolutionary for the era: high-fructose corn syrup. Have you heard of fructose? What if I told you I had a way to extract sugar sweeter than cane sugar and cheaper to produce, from cornstarch? Josh asked, his voice filled with intrigue as he addressed Margaret's doubts. The so-called high-fructose corn syrup is nothing more than the fructose-glucose syrup widely used in modern food processing, gradually replacing cane sugar in many applications. This type of sugar only became commercially available after the 1950s, but its production process is not overly complex. The most crucial components are two enzymes, amylase and glucose isomerase. The former had already been extracted by the 1930s, though it had not yet been commercialized. The latter, however, would not be discovered until the 1950s. For Josh, only the first enzyme is necessary. Its primary function is to hydrolyze starch into glucose syrup. The second enzyme's role, converting glucose into fructose to enhance sweetness, is not immediately essential. Josh's knowledge of these enzymes stemmed from a certain unfortunate drinking buddy before his transmigration. That friend worked in the raw material supply chain for fast-moving consumer goods, essentially a supplier for boba tea shops. Back when his friend was starting his business, Josh had often lent a hand during his free time, which gave him some insights into the industry. However, Josh himself was no biologist. He couldn't produce amylase or manufacture fructose syrup on his own. Fortunately, he didn't need to. He could outsource that work. Chicago, being the educational hub of the Midwest, boasts 19 universities, including prestigious institutions like the University of Chicago, Northwestern University, and the University of Illinois. There is also a wealth of research institutes. Finding a few specialists in the field wouldn't be difficult. If you're confident, go ahead and do it. Just tell me how much money you need, Margaret said after hearing Josh's plan. But since you're starting a business, you'll need to network with some influential people. It just so happens that I received an invitation to a gala this weekend. It's from Uncle John, who's hosting the event. I hadn't planned on attending, but given your new venture, we should go together. I'll introduce you to some people who could be helpful for your business. Despite the time Josh and Margaret had spent together, she had yet to bring him to any high society events. It wasn't because Josh wasn't presentable. In fact, after her father's death, Margaret had largely withdrawn from attending such gatherings. Initially, it was because people constantly whispered about Tony Windies' scandals around her, which led to arguments with former friends. Later, when she learned those rumors were true, she avoided such events altogether, fearing humiliation. Coupled with her recent struggles with David Leibler's harassment, she had even less interest in socializing. So the topic of attending galas had never come up, until now. However, if Josh wanted to start a factory and establish a business, networking was essential. This gala became a necessary occasion. What kind of gala is it? Josh asked. It's a war bond charity gala hosted by the city government, with Uncle John as the lead organizer. Influential figures from all over Chicago will be attending, Margaret explained. Josh nodded. This was indeed an event worth attending. Will it cause you any trouble? He asked. This would be his first high-profile event in either of his lifetimes. What trouble could there be? Besides, it's a good opportunity to show everyone I'm doing just fine, Margaret replied with a gentle smile. Is there anything I should keep in mind? Josh asked. Just dress handsomely. Soon, the weekend arrived. Dressed impeccably, Josh and Margaret arrived punctually at the venue, a lavish estate owned by the Leibler family. By the time they arrived, the estate was already bustling. The courtyard was filled with high-end cars from this era. Compared to these, the wine-red Lincoln Continental Josh had driven that day appeared modest. If he were to take out the Cadillac V16 from his system inventory, it would undoubtedly turn heads. But now wasn't the time. Although Josh had managed to enter Chicago's upper-class society by being with Margaret, this was far from a guarantee of security. After all, when push comes to shove, desperate people fear nothing. The Italian mobsters were known for their ruthlessness. They had even plotted to assassinate a president before. Until Josh had sufficient means to protect himself, the Cadillac would remain a personal collector's item. Thankfully, the system space preserved items in a timeless state, so there was no risk of the car deteriorating from neglect. After handing over the invitation to the attendant, Margaret and Josh entered the grand hall without issue. Margaret. Long time no see, called a familiar voice shortly after their arrival. It belonged to an elegant lady about Margaret's age. Gloria. It's been so long. Margaret warmly greeted her friend with an air kiss. The two seemed quite close. Margaret offered Josh an apologetic smile as Gloria pulled her aside to chat in private. Unable to join their conversation, Josh surveyed the surroundings to ease his awkwardness. He grabbed a glass of wine from a passing waiter's tray. While Josh wasn't fond of drinking, he wasn't a complete teetotaler. He had tested his current body's tolerance before and found it passable. What's your name? A refined-looking middle-aged man approached him. Josh. Josh Kahn, he replied politely. Patrick Chase. Gloria's my wife, the man introduced himself, gesturing toward the two women. Josh nodded in understanding. That explained why Patrick had approached him. The two struck up a casual conversation. Given that they were unfamiliar with each other, their discussion avoided anything too personal, quickly turning to the war, a popular topic for men at such events, especially at a war bond charity gala. As they talked, Josh's observations about the ongoing conflict impressed Patrick. A former logistics officer during World War I, Patrick now owned a department store in Chicago. He wasn't a stranger to military matters, and Josh's insights into the war's trajectory were refreshingly novel. Josh, with your knowledge, it's a shame you're not in the military, making a name for yourself. Patrick remarked. Josh resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Join the army? With this body, barely a ninth-grade dropout, what could he do besides carry ammunition on the front lines? In World War II, while the military rapidly expanded, officer roles weren't handed out to just anyone. Specialized branches like the Air Force or Navy still required a high school diploma at minimum. Even if he qualified, Josh had no intention of risking his life for a soulless government. Why bother when he could comfortably enjoy his life with a wealthy partner? Mr. Chase, Josh isn't even 16 yet. He's far from the legal age to enlist. Margaret interjected as she returned, slipping her arm through Josh's and glaring disapprovingly at Patrick. Patrick froze in surprise. He took another look at Josh, noting his youthful features, which he had overlooked earlier due to Josh's height, composed demeanor, and sharp insights. 16? Patrick glanced back and forth between Josh and the mature, striking Margaret. Well, in fairness, such relationships weren't unheard of among the upper classes of this era. Had it been the 21st century, Margaret might have faced legal charges. After temporarily parting ways with the Chase couple, Margaret led Josh to meet one of the hosts of the evening's event, John Leibler. Good evening, my dear. I'm so glad you could make it. You're as stunning as ever, said the seemingly kind older gentleman, greeting Margaret warmly with a gentle hug. Standing beside him were two men. One was David, whom Josh had encountered before. He was glaring at Josh with visible displeasure. The other man was an older gentleman, likely close in age to John Leibler. Thank you, Uncle John. By the way, let me introduce Josh to you, the one I mentioned before. Margaret smiled as she gestured toward Josh. Good evening, Mr. Leibler. I'm Josh Kahn. It's a pleasure to meet you, Josh said respectfully, maintaining his composure. A fine young man. Enjoy yourself, John said, giving Josh a brief, appraising look before nodding in approval and extending his hand. The gesture was a clear sign of initial acceptance, though mostly out of consideration for Margaret, who was a close family friend. Josh, understanding the importance of this moment, extended his hand and shook John's firmly, expressing his respect. Oh, and let me introduce you to Alonzo Emery, my longtime legal associate, John said, gesturing toward the older man beside him. As for David, John had no intention of introducing him. He understood his son's nature all too well. While he wouldn't mind if Margaret and David had shown mutual interest, it was evident Margaret wasn't interested in David at all. There was no point in forcing the matter or embarrassing anyone, especially not as the host of this prestigious event. David, though unhappy, wasn't foolish enough to cause a scene. Even his hostile glares at Josh remained silent. Nice to meet you, young man. If you ever have any legal issues, feel free to reach out to me, Alonzo Emery said warmly. Unlike John's casual attitude, Alonzo was much more enthusiastic. Lawyers in the U.S. held prestigious positions, but ultimately, they served wealthy clients. Margaret was a significant client of his, especially since she had recently received a substantial insurance payout, a case Alonzo himself had managed. After a brief conversation and exchanging business cards with Alonzo, Josh and Margaret moved on. At events like this, the main purpose was to meet new people and exchange contact information. Any serious discussions would happen elsewhere. Margaret guided Josh around, introducing him to various prominent figures in Chicago's business and political circles. As the evening progressed, the event reached its main focus, fundraising speeches. Since it was a war bond fundraising gala, fiery speeches from politicians were an essential part of the program. The main speakers included Chicago's mayor, a Democratic senator from Illinois, and a military representative. Josh, Do you think we'll win this war? Margaret asked, glancing at the senator delivering a passionate speech. Of course. The United States will undoubtedly emerge victorious, Josh said confidently, his knowledge of history giving him certainty. Although Josh suspected this world might be a parallel timeline, the overall trajectory of major historical events seemed intact. Unless this was an alternate reality like the man in the high castle. But even then, Josh wouldn't worry much. After all, he was of Austrian descent, a peculiar advantage in wartime. In the Axis powers, Austrians were closely aligned with Germans due to shared culture and language. Meanwhile, in the US, Austrians were considered victims of invasion and faced far less scrutiny than German Americans. How much should we contribute to the war bonds? Margaret asked, her confidence bolstered by Josh's certainty. As much as possible if you can afford it, Josh replied after a moment's thought, leaning closer to Margaret. His advice was deliberate. At this time, war bonds were one of the safest and most lucrative investments. The profit margin was a staggering 100%, depending on how the bonds were handled. During World War II, U.S. war bonds were sold at 75% or 50% of their face value and matured after 10 years. For example, a $100 bond could be purchased for $50, and after 10 years, it would be redeemable for the full $100. With a low inflation rate guaranteed by America's massive gold reserves and the Bretton Woods system, these bonds were a foolproof investment. Do you really think it's worth going all in? Margaret asked skeptically. Are you considering making a big move? Josh asked, noticing her intrigued expression. I'm thinking we should go big, Margaret replied. Josh immediately understood what she meant. Just like modern charity galas, these war bond events had a competitive edge. The person who donated the most, or purchased the highest amount of bonds, would undoubtedly attract attention from high-ranking officials and elites. For Margaret, this could be a golden opportunity to establish connections and elevate her social standing. While it wasn't realistic for her to outspend America's wealthiest elites, she could aim to be the top donor at this specific event. Do you think $3 million would be enough? Margaret asked thoughtfully. Josh nodded after considering it. The U.S. government issued war bonds in multiple rounds during the war. Even the wealthiest businessmen couldn't invest millions in every round. They had businesses to run. $3 million would likely secure Margaret's spot as the top donor of this gala without straining her finances. However, as the gala concluded and the senator announced the top donor, Josh was stunned. Josh Cohn, $3 million. The crowd erupted in applause, leaving Josh completely speechless. As expected by Margaret and Josh, the purchase of $3 million in war bonds claimed the top spot for the evening. Because of this, Josh, who had initially been a mere background figure, became the center of attention at the gala. Guests flocked to engage with him, and even individuals like John Leibler, the mayor, and the senator, who had previously not paid much attention to him, made their way over. Those aware of Josh's relationship with Margaret began to view him in a new light. Initially, many assumed Josh to be nothing more than Margaret's kept lover. But to their surprise, it turned out he was a big fish in his own right, or so they believed. Aside from Margaret, Josh, and the bank representative collecting the checks, no one knew that the funds were actually Margaret's contribution. Most of the attendees would never have guessed that Margaret, of all people, would spend such an enormous sum for a mere lover. After all, it wasn't $30,000 or $300,000. It was $3 million. For many attendees, that sum exceeded their total net worth. Even someone as familiar with Margaret as John Leibler found it hard to believe. Margaret, you didn't have to go this far, Josh whispered to her, finally free from the endless stream of guests. But isn't this the best outcome? Margaret smiled warmly. I don't run a business, so this title doesn't mean much to me. But it's different for you. After tonight, your name will be known throughout Chicago, and perhaps even across many parts of the country. This will greatly benefit you in setting up factories and businesses. If you ever decide to enter politics, this will be a valuable asset. Looking at Margaret's thoughtfulness, Josh felt deeply moved. However, at that moment, some commotion arose in the venue. Josh and Margaret noticed John Leibler leaving the gala in a hurry, accompanied by a group of people. This unusual exit sparked a wave of whispers among the guests. Though the gala's central figures were the mayor, the senator, and the military representative from the fundraising organization, as the host, John Leibler leaving early was strange. "Excuse me, but do you know what's going on?" Margaret asked a waiter. "Sorry, ma'am, I don't know either," the waiter replied with a shake of his head. Sensing the odd atmosphere, someone from the fundraising organization quickly stepped in to calm the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Leibler had to attend to a personal matter and left early. There's no need to worry. Tonight's gala has been a great success, and we thank Mr. Josh Kahn and all of you for your contributions. Let's raise our glasses." As the situation settled, Josh noticed that Emery, the lawyer who had been with John Leibler earlier, also left the venue discreetly, his expression tense. Josh had no idea what was happening, but it didn't concern him. After staying for another half hour as guests gradually departed, Josh and Margaret also decided it was time to leave. Just as they stepped outside, a figure was about to collide with Margaret. Fortunately, Josh reacted quickly, stepping in front of her. The individual, who appeared small in stature, fell to the ground from the impact. Josh, on the other hand, was unharmed. The person quickly got up and began apologizing repeatedly. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm very sorry." It was then that Josh and Margaret noticed the individual was a young woman dressed in a maid's uniform, likely one of the Leibler staff. Her head was bowed, obscuring her face, but she appeared to be around Josh's age. "No problem. Are you hurt?" Margaret asked kindly, her voice full of concern. Hearing Margaret's gentle tone, the maid finally looked up. "Audrey Hepburn." Josh blurted out upon seeing her face. The maid's resemblance to the future Hollywood icon, Audrey Hepburn, was striking. However, the young woman appeared confused. "Sir, are you speaking to me? My name isn't Audrey Hepburn, it's Sabrina Fairchild. You must have me mistaken for someone else." Josh froze in embarrassment. Mistaken identity? Wait. Suddenly, it dawned on Josh. If Margaret was a character from a movie, then perhaps this Audrey Hepburn lookalike could be from a film too? Before Josh could think further, a sharp pain shot through his waist. He turned to see Margaret looking away, feigning innocence. So, all women know this trick. Josh thought wryly. "Sorry, I must have made a mistake," Josh apologized to Sabrina. "It's all right, sir. It's my fault for bumping into you both," Sabrina said, nervously adding, "If it's okay, may I leave? I have something urgent to attend to." "Of course," Josh replied, stepping aside. "Thank you, sir." "Thank you, ma'am," Sabrina said before rushing into the hall. "Who is Audrey Hepburn?" Margaret asked as soon as Sabrina was out of earshot. "What's the matter? Jealous?" Josh teased. "Humph, why would I be jealous? You're not even mine," Margaret retorted. A few moments ago, she had been calling him dear, and now he was not hers. How quickly things change. "Don't be mad. I'll explain," Josh said with a half-truth. "She's a Dutch girl I met when my family was fleeing during the war. She's about my age, but after the war began, I lost contact with her. That girl earlier just looked a lot like her." This explanation seemed to soften Margaret's attitude. "Sorry, darling. I didn't mean to bring up bad memories," she said, her tone now full of sympathy. With this, the small misunderstanding regarding Sabrina faded away. However, as Josh and Margaret made their way home, the sight of speeding police cars and road checkpoints made them uneasy. "Officer, what's going on?" Josh asked a policeman at a checkpoint, slipping him a $20 bill as a tip. Tempted by the money and reassured by Josh and Margaret's high-end car and attire, the policeman leaned in and whispered, the Leibler Jewelry Company was robbed. Their vault was hit. Losses are estimated to be in the millions. Josh and Margaret exchanged shocked glances. No wonder John Leibler had left the gala early. As the police car lights flashed in the distance, an image of the nervous lawyer Emery sneaking out of the gala crossed Josh's mind. The next morning, after finishing breakfast, Josh sat in the living room, reading the newspaper. His expression was peculiar, a mix of emotions, leaving it unclear whether he was upset or pleased. "Darling, what's wrong?" Margaret walked over, kissed his cheek, and asked with a smile. "To be honest, I find it hard to believe that the person this paper describes is me." Josh replied helplessly, handing her the newspaper. It was a copy of the Chicago Tribune, one of the city's oldest publications and the third largest newspaper in the U.S. Margaret took the paper and couldn't help but laugh. The front page headline read, 3 million. Austrian aristocratic youth's anti-fascist resolve. The article detailed last night's charity gala, where Margaret, under Josh's name, purchased $3 million worth of war bonds. However, after some creative editorial flair, the report had taken an unusual turn. The article painted Josh and his late parents as a heroic noble family from Austria, persecuted for resisting fascism during Germany's invasion. It claimed they fled across the ocean to America, where they continued their struggle. After their untimely deaths, Josh supposedly inherited their legacy, dedicating his life to the cause by donating his fortune, a whopping $3 million, to support America's anti-fascist efforts. The passionate and vivid descriptions in the article left Josh feeling disoriented. When had he ever been so noble? And when had his family become aristocrats? Oh wait. During an interview after the gala, he had mentioned that his grandfather, this body's grandfather, was a military officer in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and had a minor noble title. But come on. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had collapsed over 2 decades ago, and the Habsburg dynasty was long gone. That grandfather had even died during World War I. Apparently, the journalist had decided to elaborate this detail. Josh found it absurd, though he could understand it, given Americans' fascination with nobility. Of course, the real purpose of the article was to promote war bond sales. The underlying message was clear: even a native of that guy's homeland is going all in to support the war. Shouldn't you, as an American citizen, do your part? This isn't bad at all. At least we achieved our goal. By the end of today, your name will be known throughout Chicago and even parts of the United States. That will be a great help for your future business ventures, Margaret said with a gentle laugh. And in my heart, you've always been the greatest. But this isn't fair to you. Josh sighed. He hadn't wanted this attention, but Margaret had been adamant. She even threatened to burn the bonds, worth a total of $6 million, if he dared reveal she was the one who paid for them. Faced with this kind of soft power, Josh had no choice but to relent. Do we really need to talk about fairness? If you feel indebted to me, then start your factories as soon as possible and build a successful business, Margaret said, giving him a warm hug. Her encouraging words reignited Josh's determination. Oh my God, look at this. The Leibler family vault robbed. 1 guard injured, 1 thief shot. Renowned crime expert Erwin Lynn Schneider suspected. So the police were telling the truth. John's family vault really was robbed. Margaret exclaimed as she turned to another page in the newspaper. Yeah, I saw that. But don't worry about your Uncle John. In cases like this, the insurance company is far more anxious than the victim, Josh replied casually. Under normal circumstances, this kind of heist would have made the front page. But during wartime, such news couldn't overshadow Josh's headline. The U.S. was in full swing, elevating war heroes and narratives to support the effort. However, Josh's point was valid. This was a commercial insurance vault, not a private family vault, meaning it was insured. The insurance company would undoubtedly be more concerned than the Leiblers. You're right. Insurance. That's such a relief, Margaret said, finally relaxing after Josh's reminder. By the way, what do you think of that lawyer, Emery? What kind of person is he? Josh suddenly asked. Lawyer Emery? Why bring him up? Margaret asked, puzzled. Well, he's one of the top legal experts in the city. I'll need a lot of legal support soon when I start my company, Josh replied, without mentioning his suspicions about Emery. In terms of expertise, Uncle John says he's among the best. But as a person... Margaret trailed off. What about him? Josh pressed, curious. I've heard his private life is a mess. He keeps a mistress young enough to be his granddaughter. I only know this because I hired a private investigator a while back, Margaret said quietly. Hearing this, Josh raised an eyebrow. Margaret's comment about the lawyer seemed like a subtle warning aimed at him. Honestly, Margaret was overthinking. With a stunning woman like her by his side, few could catch his eye. Still, as he thought that, Sabrina's face briefly flashed in his mind. Shaking his head, Josh dismissed the thought. Without a movie star aura, she wasn't particularly special. By the way, I have a meeting at McKinsey later. Want to come with me? Josh asked, changing the subject. McKinsey, in this case, was a management consulting firm, not related to the controversial McCarthyism of the 50s. Josh needed to build 3 factories, and he couldn't do it alone. He needed to hire professionals. Management consulting firms like McKinsey were already providing headhunting services in the 1930s. Last week, Josh had submitted his staffing requirements, and on Friday, McKinsey had sent over a list of candidates. Now it was time for Josh to interview them. "I'll pass. I'm not interested in that. Besides, I've managed to get a set of equipment from Uncle John. It's arriving today, and I'll be busy cutting the pink heart diamond for a while," Margaret replied. The pink heart was the massive pink diamond Margaret planned to cut in private, given its immense value and sensitivity. The interviews at McKinsey Consulting went exceptionally well. Josh successfully hired 5 qualified individuals, 3 experienced managers, 1 financial officer, and 1 administrative secretary. All 5 were men. This was normal for the pre-World War II era. Even in a progressive country like the United States, women's participation in the workforce was minimal and concentrated in fields considered suitable for women, such as teaching, clerical work, and retail services. It wasn't until the U.S. entered the war, when men enlisted in droves and labor shortages arose, that women were actively encouraged by the Roosevelt administration to fill roles across various industries. After the war ended, however, many women lost their jobs as returning male workers reclaimed their positions. This trend persisted until the 1960s, when significant social change began to occur. Similarly, access to higher education for women was limited. While some public universities admitted women as early as the 19th century, these institutions were often community or vocational colleges, teaching basic career skills. Elite schools such as Harvard, Yale, and Caltech only started admitting women much later, typically in the 1970s. Even MIT, which began admitting women in 1911, maintained a very low enrollment rate for female students. Thus, finding well-educated female professionals in this era was rare unless they came from prominent families working for their own businesses. If Josh didn't want a mere decoration for his office, hiring men was the only option. After completing the interviews, Josh assigned tasks to his new team. The managers were to scout suitable factory locations, while the financial officer and secretary were tasked with finding a suitable office space. With the work delegated, Josh declined an invitation to a celebratory dinner with McKinsey executives and prepared to return home. As he exited the building, a fleet of police cars sped by, sirens blaring. Moments later, the distinct rattle of machine guns echoed from the direction of the Lakeside district. Josh hesitated but quickly decided to avoid trouble and head in the opposite direction. Staying out of it seemed the wisest course of action. However, as Murphy's Law dictates, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. While taking a detour along a quiet park road, a man suddenly appeared in front of his car. Josh instinctively slammed on the brakes. Since the road was narrow and his speed was low, he managed to avoid hitting the man. But when Josh got a better look, he immediately regretted stopping. The man was towering, likely over 6 feet 6 inches tall, and holding a gun aimed directly at Josh. "Hey buddy, don't do anything rash. Let's talk this out," Josh said, raising his hands in surrender. Inside, however, he was already planning to retrieve a shotgun from his system inventory as soon as he saw an opening. "Apologies, sir, but we just need your car," the tall man said, motioning with the gun for Josh to step out. Well-mannered or not, Josh mentally labeled him a dead man walking. But wait, did he say we? Before Josh could dwell on it, another figure emerged from the bushes. This one was an older gentleman in a sharp suit, carrying a black leather bag. He seemed dignified yet utterly out of place in this tense situation. Josh recognized him immediately, Lyndon Schneider. The man's face had been all over the morning papers in connection with the high-profile heist. "Well, isn't this just my lucky day?" Josh thought sarcastically. "My apologies, sir, but we truly do need this vehicle," Schneider said, doffing his hat and bowing politely. However, as his gaze fell on Josh's face, he paused, visibly taken aback. "Young man, what is your relation to Heinz Kahn?" Schneider asked, his tone curious. Josh froze. Heinz Kahn was the name of his late father. "You knew my father?" Josh asked, frowning. "Indeed. That must make you Josh Kahn." "I'm Erwin Lyndon Schneider, a friend of your father's," the old man replied. "Oh, I know who you are. We were just on the same front page this morning," Josh thought. Still, if Schneider could accurately name his father, his claim might hold some truth. The man's Bavarian accent, his German surname, and his old-fashioned manners seemed consistent with someone who might have been acquainted with Josh's Austrian family. "But I don't recall my father ever mentioning a criminal friend," Josh said with a hint of sarcasm. "And I certainly don't think any friend of his would aim a gun at his child." "Fair enough. If I were a father, I wouldn't tell my child about such a friend either," Schneider admitted without offense. Then he turned to the tall man. "Dix, lower the gun." The tall man, Dix, complied without hesitation. "Apologies, young man," Schneider said, addressing Josh. "Our situation is dire. The police are hunting us, and we're left with no choice but to borrow your vehicle. Rest assured, you can report this incident to the authorities, and I trust they'll treat you fairly. In the meantime, please accept this as compensation." To Josh's surprise, Schneider opened his leather bag and pulled out a handful of uncut diamonds, placing them in Josh's hands. For a moment, Josh was at a loss. The car was valuable. His Lincoln Continental was a gift from Margaret and held sentimental value. But the jewels Schneider had handed over were worth several times that amount. As he weighed the diamonds in his palm, an idea began to take shape in Josh's mind. As Schneider and Dix started the car's engine, Josh spoke. "I believe you might need a place to lay low." The elderly Lyndon Schneider and the burly Dix were both fugitives. Naturally, Josh couldn't risk taking them to his own home. That would not only endanger Margaret, but also himself. Instead, he brought them to his late parents' old apartment. Though Josh had long planned to sell the place, it had never been successfully sold. Bringing the two fugitives, there was a calculated move. If they were eventually caught and ratted him out, Josh could argue his innocence convincingly. For instance, he could claim that Lyndon Schneider, being an old friend of his father, knew about the address and had access to the keys. This would distance Josh from the situation entirely. So long as Josh stuck to this narrative, even if the two wanted to implicate him, the police and courts wouldn't have enough to convict him. Besides, if they had any sense, Schneider and Dix would be unlikely to blame Josh. Though they had stolen a significant amount of jewels, according to the morning papers, no one had been killed during the heist, except for a security guard who had suffered minor injuries. As long as they hadn't committed murder, the law of this time wouldn't treat their crime as a severe offense, especially since they were white men. At most, they might face a few years in prison. By establishing good relations, Josh might even be able to help them get out early. What good would betraying him accomplish? Upon arrival, Josh casually chatted with the building supervisor, pretending to inquire about the apartment's sale status. Meanwhile, Schneider and Dix slipped past unnoticed, heading upstairs. Josh joined them shortly afterward to unlock the door and let them in. Thankfully, they encountered no one during the process. "I spoke to the building supervisor. The police conducted a search here earlier today, so this place should be safe for now," Josh said after locking the door behind them. "Thank you very much, young man," Schneider said, bowing stiffly. "Don't thank me just yet," Josh waved him off. "First, explain yourselves. What's your situation? The papers implied there were more of you. I assume the gunshots I heard near Lakeside earlier were connected to your group. And how exactly did you know my father?" Schneider and Dix exchanged glances. After a brief hesitation, they told Josh the full story. It turned out that Josh's earlier suspicions were correct. The heist was indeed connected to Attorney Emery, who was one of the masterminds. Schneider himself was the other. The entire affair began a month earlier when Schneider had just been released from prison. The newly freed criminal mastermind wasted no time heading to Chicago, where he approached a local fixer named Corby. Schneider proposed a lucrative business opportunity that required manpower and a buyer. The job was the theft of the Leibler family's jewel vault. With Schneider's reputation for intelligence and reliability, Corby eagerly introduced him to a high-profile client, Attorney Emery. Emery not only agreed to fund the operation, but also promised to purchase the stolen jewels at above-market value. Tempted by the high payout, Schneider agreed. He quickly assembled a team, which included Dix and 3 others, Lewis, Goss, and Cody. Initially, the heist went smoothly. However, things took a turn when a security guard stumbled upon their escape route. Though Dix managed to knock the guard unconscious, the man's firearm accidentally discharged, hitting Lewis. Forced to split up to avoid capture, Goss took the injured Lewis to a back-alley doctor. Schneider, Dix, and Cody went to meet Emery to exchange the goods for payment. This explained why Emery had hastily left the gala the previous evening after John Leibler's departure. He was preparing to receive the stolen goods. However, Emery had no intention of paying. Strapped for cash and on the verge of bankruptcy, the attorney planned to double-cross Schneider and flee to Mexico with the jewels. But Emery had underestimated his adversaries. Schneider might have been a non-violent criminal, but Dix and Cody were not. The confrontation left Emery's trusted enforcer, Bob Braunow, dead at Dix's hands. Though Dix and Cody were ready to kill Emery as well, Schneider stopped them. Recognizing their precarious position, without a buyer and unable to fence such high-value jewels, Schneider proposed a new plan. He suggested Emery negotiate with the insurance company. If they offered the jewels at a lower price, the company might privately buy them back to offset their payout to the Leibler family. Emery reluctantly agreed, disposing of his accomplice's body in the process. But things didn't end there. Unknown to Schneider, the police had been keeping tabs on him since his release from prison. Combined with pressure from the Leibler's family and city officials, a warrant was issued for Schneider's arrest, even without solid evidence linking him to the crime. Shortly after leaving Emery's estate, Schneider and Dix found themselves tailed by police. In the ensuing chaos, Cody sacrificed himself to lead the authorities away, allowing Schneider and Dix to escape, only to run into Josh. During Schneider's recounting, he repeatedly emphasized his close relationship with Josh's father. He even claimed that he had helped the family immigrate to the United States. Josh remained skeptical but couldn't entirely dismiss the possibility. After all, Schneider had accurately described his father's past and handed him a bag of diamonds without hesitation. Given the circumstances, extending a helping hand seemed reasonable. After some thought, Josh offered his advice. "If you trust me, your best option is to surrender," he said. "Why?" Schneider asked, puzzled. "From what you've told me, Emery is a key player in all of this. If you align your story and pin the blame on him, I can talk to John Leibler on your behalf. Once he learns his legal advisor is a traitor, he'll likely help you out. If we can make Emery the scapegoat, you'll only be charged as accomplices. With mitigating factors like surrendering and cooperation, I can get you a good lawyer. You might not even serve time, just a light sentence with the possibility of parole. Isn't that better than running for the rest of your lives?" Schneider fell silent, contemplating the proposal. Josh's logic was sound, but he couldn't help gripping the bag of jewels tighter, reluctant to part with them. "Sir, it's not that simple," Dix interjected. "Our current heist might not have caused any serious harm, but I won't lie to you, we accidentally killed a tennis player about 2 weeks ago. Plus, we've got a few other skeletons in our closet. Surrendering won't be as easy as you think." Josh's jaw dropped, and he choked on his drink, coughing violently. "Mr. Kahn, are you all right?" Seeing Josh suddenly cough violently, both Lyndon Schneider and Dix looked at him with genuine concern. After all, Josh was quickly becoming their only hope. "Cough, cough, I'm fine, just choked on my own saliva," Josh waved it off, signaling that he was okay. He then turned his attention to Dix, scrutinizing him up and down. So, it's the good guy. He mentally kicked himself for not recognizing him earlier. In fairness though, the other night, he had been observing them from over 30 meters away in the dim glow of early dawn. The streetlights of this era weren't exactly known for their brightness, so failing to identify anyone's face was understandable. "Sir, does my situation trouble you?" "It's all right, I can leave right now. Mr. Schneider and my past actions are unrelated." "Let him go and turn himself in," Dix said, standing up when he noticed Josh staring at him. "That won't be necessary," Josh said, lost in thought. "Your other cases do complicate things a little, but it's not insurmountable. Worst case, I can arrange for a boat to get you to Canada. You can lay low there for a while until the situation cools off." Normally, Josh wouldn't bother going out of his way to help someone like Dix. Frankly, if Lyndon Schneider hadn't been connected to his father, Josh wouldn't have lifted a finger to help either, especially not after being threatened at gunpoint. But Dix's actions spoke volumes. Not only had he protected Schneider throughout the ordeal, but the loyalty and camaraderie he'd shown earlier, standing up for the older man, had softened Josh's stance. After all, as Lyndon Schneider had explained, he and Dix's group had only known each other for less than a week. They weren't close associates, just individuals brought together by a short-term deal. According to their agreement, the heist spoils, all those valuable jewels, belonged entirely to Schneider. Dix and his team were only hired for a fixed fee of $20,000 per person. Yet despite this limited arrangement, Dix and his men not only refrained from coveting the jewels but risked their lives to protect Schneider, even now going so far as to advocate for him. Such loyalty was unexpected. Josh couldn't help but marvel at how, in this era, even hardened criminals seem to have a strong sense of honor. Wouldn't that be too much trouble? Dix asked, clearly surprised by Josh's suggestion. Under normal circumstances, it would be a hassle, Josh replied. But you're not the primary target here. Mr. Schneider and the jewels are. If he turns himself in, and the pressure from the Leibler family and the insurance company eases, the police will be eager to close the case. Once the citywide lockdown lifts, smuggling you out will be much easier. Hearing this, Dix, who had been on edge for over 24 hours, finally relaxed a little, sinking back into the sofa. However, as soon as he sat, he winced, clutching his side and letting out a sharp breath. Are you injured? Josh raised an eyebrow and noticed the blood-soaked area near Dix's waist as he lifted his shirt. The entire lower part of his undershirt was stained deep red. It's nothing, just a graze from a bullet. I've already dressed it, Dix said, shaking his head. Josh wasn't buying it. There was no way a simple graze would bleed so profusely or cause such visible pain. If you don't stop the bleeding, it's going to get serious, Josh said as he inspected the wound. But you're in luck. With that, he walked into the bedroom, returning shortly with a medical kit. Of course, only Josh knew that the kit had come from his system's storage space. As a time traveler, he made it a priority to stay prepared for any situation, especially in an era as unpredictable as this one. While life in the United States was relatively stable, it didn't hurt to be cautious. Thanks to the system's storage capabilities, he didn't have to worry about space or expiration dates. Inside the kit were basic supplies, bandages, simple tools, and medications, including morphine and sulfa powder. Unfortunately, there was no penicillin. Although Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928, it wasn't immediately recognized for its potential. It wasn't until 1940 that its antibacterial properties were confirmed, and large-scale production only began in 1942, after U.S. pharmaceutical companies got involved. Even now, penicillin was still a regulated experimental drug. For now, sulfa drugs were the best available option. With no professionals among them, the three men resorted to a straightforward and crude method. Dix bit down on a rag while Josh sprinkled sulfa powder onto the wound, administered 5 milligrams of morphine, and wrapped the injury with fresh bandages. Yes, morphine had addictive properties, but dosage was key. Modern research showed that doses under 5 milligrams were relatively safe. The rampant addiction seen among soldiers during World War I and II resulted primarily from the life-saving practice of administering large 30-milligram doses. This is all I can do for now. Stay here and rest. Later, I'll see if I can bring in a doctor. Mr. Schneider, you'll come with me to meet Mr. Leibler, Josh said after securing Dix's bandage. He'd done everything he could for Dix. The rest was in the man's own hands. Thank you, sir. Dix said earnestly. Josh simply smiled. Thank yourself, he said cryptically, leaving Dix puzzled. Without explaining further, Josh and Schneider left. Before departing, Josh made a quick phone call to confirm John Leibler's whereabouts. Since the theft involved the renowned attorney Emery and the Leibler family's long-standing partner, it was crucial to notify Leibler in advance. Leibler's stance would be key to reducing Schneider's sentence. At the moment, John Leibler was swamped with the aftermath of the theft. Although the insurance company would cover the direct financial loss, the stolen gems represented a significant portion of the company's inventory, and replacing them during wartime wouldn't be easy. Initially, when Leibler's secretary informed him of Josh's request for a meeting, he was reluctant. However, remembering Josh's heroics the previous night and the favorable press coverage that morning, he realized Josh's influence was growing. After some thought, he agreed to the meeting, unaware that Josh was about to deliver a monumental surprise. 2 hours later, Josh and John Leibler stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in Leibler's office, watching as Lyndon Schneider was escorted into a police car. Although Schneider had already received John Leibler's forgiveness, the case had attracted significant attention, necessitating some formalities. Schneider would need to spend some time in the police holding facility, though it was almost certain he wouldn't end up in prison. Josh, I really can't thank you enough for this. John Leibler expressed his gratitude with genuine warmth. His thanks were sincere. Schneider's decision to turn himself in had resolved a significant problem for Leibler, not merely the stolen jewels. While the jewels were touted as being worth $1 million, anyone familiar with the jewelry industry would know that the production cost was less than 30% of that value. For the wealthy Leibler family, such a loss was relatively minor, merely an inconvenience in replenishing stock and a loss of indirect profits. What truly pleased John Leibler was the exposure of Emery as a major insider threat, particularly before the police had discovered it. As a lawyer who had worked with the Leibler family for decades, Emery had access to a wealth of confidential information about the Leibler Group. If this information were to leak, it would result in losses far greater than the theft of jewels. Had the police uncovered Emery's role in the case first, it could have led to unforeseen complications. Josh's decision to bring Schneider to John Leibler for reconciliation before involving the police proved to be a fortunate and timely move, giving Leibler sufficient time to clean up any sensitive loose ends. Haha, Uncle John, there's no need to be so formal. You're Margaret's uncle, and that makes you mine too. We're family. Josh replied tactfully. Yes, we're family. John Leibler was momentarily startled before bursting into laughter. He clapped Josh on the shoulder, clearly delighted. Yesterday, Josh's public gesture of purchasing war bonds had improved Leibler's impression of him. Now, Leibler truly saw Josh in a favorable light. He couldn't help but think that Margaret had chosen wisely this time. Father, I heard. Why are you here? At that moment, John Leibler's second son, David Leibler, barged in. Upon seeing Josh, his face immediately darkened. What kind of behavior is this? Can't you see I have a guest? Where are your manners? John Leibler's anger flared at his son's rude demeanor. Compared to Josh, who displayed maturity far beyond his years, Leibler's 30-something younger son was a constant source of frustration. Fortunately, John had never pinned his hopes on this frivolous, womanizing son. His eldest son, who managed the family's businesses across several eastern states, was the true heir to the family legacy. David, accustomed to his father's reprimands, merely shrugged it off and reluctantly greeted Josh. Josh, unbothered, bid farewell to John Leibler and left the Leibler Group. Having already informed Margaret of his whereabouts, he didn't rush home. Instead, he stopped to buy food and supplies to take to Dick's, ensuring the man wouldn't starve before his injuries had a chance to heal. As he walked through the streets, Josh noticed that the police checkpoints, which had been everywhere just a day before, were gone. Only the usual patrol officers remained. It was clear that with Schneider's surrender and the resolution of the jewelry theft case, the police were eager to close the matter and move on. You look much better, Josh remarked when he arrived at the apartment and saw Dix looking healthier. Dix's gunshot wound was a through-and-through injury that hadn't hit any organs. As long as the bleeding had stopped and there was no infection, a doctor's visit might not even be necessary. Yes, the bleeding has stopped. Thank you so much, Mr. Karn. What's the situation outside? Dix thanked Josh before asking about the outside world. There's good news and bad news, Josh replied. The good news is that the police have withdrawn, so you don't need to worry about being hunted or fleeing to Canada. That is good news. And the bad news? Dix nodded, bracing himself. Your companion Cody was killed in a shootout with the police, Josh said, shrugging as he shared the information he had gleaned from the police. Lewis and Goss? Dix sighed heavily at Cody's death. Though he had expected the possibility, hearing the news still weighed on him. However, he quickly composed himself and inquired about his other partners. The police didn't mention them, so they likely weren't caught, Josh replied. Thank you. Dix expressed his gratitude. Knowing his other companions were safe gave him some solace. All right, don't overthink it. Rest up. I'll check on you tomorrow. Leaving the food and supplies behind, Josh departed. After spending so much time out, Margaret was probably worried. Sure enough, when Josh returned home, Margaret asked about his visit to the Leibler Group. Josh didn't hide anything, recounting his chance encounter with Lyndon Schneider, his connection to Josh's father, and how he convinced Schneider to surrender. Emery orchestrated all this? That's unbelievable, Margaret remarked, shocked to learn that someone they knew was behind the theft. However, Knowing that the situation had been resolved put her at ease. Josh also thought the matter was settled, but there was still a twist to come. The next morning, the newspapers reported that the jewelry theft case had been solved. Alongside the news of Schneider's surrender, 2 additional developments caught Josh off guard. First, Emery had shot himself before the police could apprehend him. Second, a middleman named Corby, apprehended by Officer Dietrich, confessed to the involvement of everyone, including Emery. This led the police to Lewis's home the same night. However, they found him gravely injured and already dead. Only one accomplice, Goss, was arrested. Now, Dix was the only one still at large. Fortunately for Josh, this small twist didn't pose any real issues. In May, after spending over a month in the detention center, Lyndon Schneider walked out through the steel gates, carrying his luggage. As soon as he stepped outside, he spotted Dix across the street, leaning against a car and smoking. "Welcome back, Doc." Dix extinguished his cigarette, casually flicking it aside, and strode over to greet him. "Hey, Dix. How dare you show up here so openly? Aren't you still wanted?" Lyndon Schneider asked, visibly surprised. He clearly remembered that night over a month ago when he saw their other accomplice, Goss, being taken into custody along with the broker, Corby. He also knew Corby had sold everyone out. Dix should be on the wanted list, yet here he was, standing boldly outside the detention center. "Ha ha ha, wanted? That's old news. My warrant was rescinded over 2 weeks ago," Dix said proudly, taking Schneider's suitcase. "What happened?" Schneider asked, thoroughly confused. "It's pretty simple. Corby retracted his confession, and Goss took the blame for everything. So I was off the hook," Dix explained with a tinge of sadness. Although he was free, the thought of his good friend Goss serving extra years in prison weighed on him. Was it Mr. Kahn? Schneider immediately made the connection. The only person with enough influence to orchestrate such an outcome had to be Josh Kahn, the man who had convinced him to turn himself in. In truth, Schneider knew his early release and comfortable treatment in the detention center were all thanks to Josh's intervention. Initially, he assumed Josh was helping because of his connection to Schneider's late father. But now, seeing Dix also receiving such care, Schneider realized there must be another reason behind Josh's generosity. Of course. Who else but Mr. Kahn? He even asked me to pick you up today. Come on, hop in. I'll take you to see your new home. Dix clapped Schneider on the shoulder and led him to the car. New home? What new home? Schneider asked, puzzled. A cozy apartment, obviously. Unless you'd rather sleep on the streets. Dix joked. This is also arranged by Mr. Kahn, isn't it? And I take it you're working for him now? Schneider asked. Absolutely. Bosses as generous as Mr. Kahn are hard to come by. Look at this car, a Chrysler. Nice, isn't it? A gift from him. Dix proudly patted the steering wheel. It's a fine car, Schneider acknowledged, running his hand over the leather seats. Don't worry, you'll get one too. Dix laughed heartily. Dix drove swiftly, and in about half an hour, they arrived at an apartment building in the Upper North neighborhood. The building wasn't far from Josh's old place, but the apartment was much more spacious, a comfortable 800-square-foot space, which was more than enough for a single man like Schneider. Here are the keys. Take some time to settle in. Later, I'll come back and take you out for a surprise to celebrate your release. Ever heard of Night Rose? The girls there are fiery hot. Dix said with a wink. Dix, all of this was arranged by Mr. Kahn, wasn't it? I think I should thank him in person, Schneider said. He felt uneasy accepting so much without giving anything in return. Relax, buddy. Just enjoy yourself today. You'll meet Mr. Kahn tomorrow, Dix reassured him. Despite Dix's words, Schneider couldn't fully shake his unease. However, as Dix had promised, the girls at Night Rose were so intoxicatingly charming that Schneider quickly forgot all his worries. By the time he woke up, it was nearly noon the next day. Later that afternoon, Dix took Schneider to meet Josh at a small but clean restaurant. Oddly, although it was lunchtime, the restaurant was empty except for Josh and a single waitress. That's Anna, Lewis's wife. After Lewis passed away, it's just her and their son. I used my share of the money to buy this restaurant for her to run so they'd have some stability, Dix explained, noticing Schneider's curiosity. As for today, the restaurant is closed temporarily because Mr. Kahn is here. Schneider nodded in understanding. He also suspected that Dix's care for Anna and her son went beyond mere kindness. But that wasn't his business. Mr. Schneider, you're looking well. I heard from Dix, for ladies last night. Truly impressive. Josh teased with a smile as Schneider entered. Schneiders felt embarrassed at the remark. Though he was older and somewhat reserved, his Bavarian roots didn't prevent him from enjoying life's pleasures. After being cooped up for so long, he had let loose last night, indulging himself to the fullest. Mr. Kahn, you jest. I must thank you for your hospitality. I owe you so much, and I don't know how to repay you. If there's anything you need me to do, please just let me know, Schneider said respectfully. If he had initially seen Josh as a young man deserving respect because of his father, he now regarded him as a truly capable and influential figure. Excellent. It seems you understand why I've done all this. In that case, I'll get straight to the point. The work I have for you isn't difficult. I have a lot of sensitive goods that need to be sold and some materials I need to procure. But given the current situation in the US, I need someone sharp to handle these matters for me, Josh explained bluntly. Schneider instantly understood. Sensitive goods? Procurement? In other words, smuggling. And as luck would have it, this was a line of work he was very familiar with. This job, I'm a pro at it, he said confidently. These are the first batch of goods you'll be handling. In a warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago's industrial district, Josh gestured toward the room full of wooden crates and addressed Lyndon Schneider and Dix. He pointed at one of the crates beside him. Dix, open it. Dix stepped forward and opened the crate as instructed. Seeing its contents, Dix's eyes lit up, and Lyndon Schneider's widened in astonishment. Tobacco of such high quality. Lyndon exclaimed. Are all the crates in this warehouse tobacco? That's right. All of it is raw, processed tobacco. Your job is to figure out how to sell it. Whether you sell it as loose tobacco or make it into cigarettes, I don't care. Once sold, you each get 10% of the profits, and another 10% will go to the other associates. The rest comes to me. Alternatively, instead of cash, you can give me other goods I need, such as firearms, steel, cloth, grain, and so on. If you find better trade deals, let me know in advance. What do you think? Any questions? Josh asked, looking at Lyndon. In later generations, when people discuss the most profitable illegal industries, their first thoughts usually jump to gambling, drugs, or arms trafficking. Especially drugs, which often boast hundreds of times the profit margin. However, many people don't realize that in America, drugs have never been the most lucrative illegal industry. By the 21st century, while drugs like cocaine and heroin could generate over $100 billion in annual sales in the US, their net profit margins weren't actually that high, less than 20%. The reasons included high processing costs, market dispersion, and high transportation risks. It only seemed extraordinarily profitable because of multiple layers of distribution, inflating its apparent value. In fact, when compared to industries like health supplements, e.g., sugar water sold as bird's nest costing $3 to produce and sold for $30, drugs weren't as profitable. As for arms trafficking, the real money lies in legitimate arms deals conducted by major corporations. Even the so-called Lord of War at his peak only made a few $billion annually from illegal transactions. So, what's the most profitable illegal industry in America? Between 1919 and the 1950s, it was alcohol, thanks to Prohibition. After the 1950s, it became cigarettes, contraband tobacco. Legal tobacco is already a highly profitable industry, and illegal contraband cigarettes are even more so. Take New York in 2021 as an example. Because of the nation's highest cigarette taxes, a pack of legal cigarettes retailed for an average of $13, with a wholesale price of $12.50, leaving a profit margin of only 50 cents. Contraband cigarettes, however, had a cost price of under $1 per pack for smugglers. Including transportation costs, it wouldn't exceed $3. They could sell to local distributors at $5.6, yielding a profit margin of over 200%. Downstream distributors could sell contraband cigarettes at $12, still undercutting legal market prices, and earn $5.6 per pack, a profit margin exceeding 100%. In other regions, where cigarettes aren't as expensive, the average retail price still exceeds $7 per pack. This enormous profit margin has led to contraband/illicit cigarettes occupying over 60% of the U.S. market. The risks also differ dramatically between drugs and tobacco. Selling drugs, even in small quantities, risks severe criminal charges and often results in the loss of citizenship rights. Penalties were even harsher in earlier decades. Selling contraband cigarettes, by contrast, unless caught by the IRS with irrefutable evidence, offenders usually face a fine at most. The disparity in risk is worlds apart. As a result, starting in the 1950s, organized crime groups like the Mafia, known for their structured operations and efficient logistics, shifted their focus toward tobacco sales. Let the Mexicans and Colombians handle the drugs. Tobacco is where the real money is. Once I read a fact that by the 1990s, 90% of the contraband cigarettes in the US were made in China. The only challenge with contraband tobacco lies upstream. It requires skilled management. This was why Josh placed so much trust in Lyndon Schneider. Known as a criminal expert, Schneider wasn't just highly intelligent and experienced in smuggling. He was also a legitimate doctor, holding a PhD from the University of Munich in national economics. How someone with that background ended up resorting to theft is anyone's guess. Then again, given Germany's post-World War I economic collapse, perhaps it wasn't too surprising. How much tobacco is here? Schneider asked, his expression solemn as he surveyed the warehouse filled with crates. 40 tons. Josh replied with a grin. 40 tons. Schneider gasped, his hand trembling. In this era, cigarette prices were influenced by currency purchasing power. A carton of cigarettes cost around $10. While this might not seem high, when adjusted for purchasing power relative to gold, it was actually more expensive than in later generations. By 2021, the dollar had devalued nearly 40-fold. 40 tons of tobacco, if used responsibly, could yield around 40 million cigarettes, 1 million packs, or 100,000 cartons, valued at $2 million. However, contraband sellers weren't concerned with quality. By loosening the rolls or mixing in dry grass, production could double to 80 million cigarettes. Even after accounting for downstream sales margins, they could clear $2 million in profit. If their cut was 20%, that meant $400,000, a far better return than stealing gemstones, where a $1 million haul might net 30%. Not to mention, selling tobacco carried significantly lower risks. Of course we can do it. Schneider exclaimed, his eyes gleaming. Contraband tobacco wasn't just lucrative and low risk. It could also be bartered for resources that money couldn't buy, especially in chaotic regions like Europe. If this tobacco were shipped to Europe, Schneider could trade it for a fortune in gold. However, Mr. Karn, selling such a large quantity will require startup funds, additional weapons and manpower, Schneider added after calming himself. Manpower and weapons have already been prepared by Dix, and here's $50,000 as startup capital. Also, I'd like to introduce someone. Lieutenant Dietrich, step forward, Josh said, clapping his hands. From the shadows, a man in plain clothes emerged. It was none other than Police Captain Dietrich, who had appeared several times before. Mr. Kahn, long time no see, Mr. Schneider, Dietrich greeted Josh respectfully before turning to Schneider with a faintly arrogant demeanor. Captain Dietrich. Schneider greeted him with a peculiar expression, immediately grasping why Josh had introduced the captain. The profits from tobacco were the carrot, and Dietrich's presence was the stick. Having someone like Dietrich on their side would undoubtedly simplify tobacco sales. By the way, Schneider, your early release wouldn't have been possible without the captain's help. He and his colleagues will also take a cut of the profits. You'll need to work closely together, Josh said with a smile. We're all smart people here. You understand what this business represents. This is just the first shipment. Do well, and everyone will prosper. But if anyone gets other ideas, I suggest they think twice about the consequences. The group hastily nodded in agreement. Good. I'll leave the rest to you. I have other matters to attend to, Josh said before leaving the warehouse. As for whether Schneider would betray him and keep the tobacco, Josh wasn't worried. He had 2 layers of safeguards. First, Dix's men were Kentucky cowboys, all with families. Even Dix himself had ties to Lewis's widow. Schneider wouldn't succeed without their cooperation. Second, there was Dietrich, a genuine dirty cop whose weaknesses Josh had thoroughly exploited. With a family to support and a lucrative stake in the tobacco trade, Dietrich had every reason to remain loyal. The odds of betrayal were slim, especially since Josh controlled the supply chain. And where was that supply chain? Westeros. Yes, beyond legitimate trade ventures, Josh had discovered another gold mine in tobacco during his dealings with Daenerys. In Westeros, tobacco wasn't smoked but chewed, much like betel nut. Due to its medicinal properties and addictive nature, it was highly popular among the nobility. This had led to extensive cultivation, especially in Daenerys' slave-free regions, where labor costs were negligible. For Daenerys, however, tobacco was a useless commodity in her quest for conquest. She was happy to sell it to Josh at rock-bottom prices, giving him another delightful surprise. Time flies, and before anyone realized, summer had arrived, bringing with it the sweltering heat of Chicago. Early in the morning, Josh, dressed in a polo shirt, sat leisurely in the yard, sipping coffee. Of course, it wasn't just coffee he indulged in. He wasn't some city dweller from Shanghai, dependent on coffee to survive. Occasionally, he would have some black tea too. As for green tea, it wasn't that he didn't want to drink it. The issue was that, much like in Britain, black tea dominated the market in the US outside of Chinatown. Finding green tea was nearly impossible. But with the raging Pacific War, Asian goods were hardly making it across the ocean. Even in Chinatown, green tea was scarce, and whatever was available was mostly low-quality tea dust. The situation might be slightly better on the West Coast in Los Angeles, but in a Midwest city like Chicago? Sigh. So for the time being, Josh had resigned himself to drinking coffee and black tea. Honestly, he could count himself lucky. Thanks to his wealth and influence, he could afford such luxuries. For an ordinary person, even coffee and black tea were hard to come by. Both were rationed items. Coffee was limited to 1 pound every 5 weeks per person, and black tea to 20 grams per week. What kind of rationing is that? Feeding a cat? Well, he only had to endure this for 2 more years. He was young and could wait it out. "Darling, I've got some bad news. It seems you've caught the attention of the USO," said Margaret, wearing a sheer white dress as she sat down beside Josh with an invitation in hand. 3 months? They're here to sell bonds again. Josh groaned at the mention of the USO. It was early July. Back in late March, he had purchased $3 million worth of bonds, which had indeed brought him considerable fame and benefits. For example, the establishment of 3 factories had gone almost without a hitch, with raw material supplies guaranteed. The syrup factory, in particular, had hired researchers from the University of Chicago, leading to the successful mass production of glucose isomerase just a month ago. The first batch of corn syrup had passed military testing a week ago. After evaluation by military representatives, the entire batch, along with future production, was contracted by the military. Josh had thus secured a partnership with the world's most powerful military at the time. Not necessarily for the quality, but because, in terms of scale and equipment, the U.S. Army was undoubtedly #1. However, there was a price to pay. Since then, he had been targeted by numerous anti-fascist organizations of that era, constantly seeking donations. Aren't you a pioneer against fascism? You can afford $3 million in bonds. Surely, a few thousand or tens of thousands for our cause isn't too much to ask. Thankfully, most of these small organizations were easy to handle. He would often excuse himself by saying, "All my money went into bonds. How about I donate some bonds instead?" At that point, they usually backed off. These organizations needed cash and supplies. Bonds, while valuable, couldn't be liquidated in the short term. But leave the bonds untouched? Then the question arose, were these groups really fighting fascism or just lining their pockets? However, if they tried cashing the bonds at a bank? Impossible. The military sold bonds to raise funds for the war effort. Cashing them in early? That was out of the question. A regular citizen lacking money might be excused, but an anti-fascist organization doing so? It would look like they were undermining the U.S. military. The ones tied to the military, however, weren't so easy to dismiss. Josh's syrup factory had just secured a massive military contract. Claiming poverty wouldn't work. The U.S. military was a model client in this regard. Most contracts were prepaid or paid upon delivery, no delays or IOUs. Unlike the British neighbors, who were notorious for handing out IOUs. But Josh had barely received the money when the USO came knocking. The invitation they sent him was clear: "You've made quite the profit from your orders. Isn't it time to support us? Maybe buy some more bonds? The interest is decent, and you wouldn't lose out, would you?" Could Josh refuse? If he didn't buy, he could kiss future military contracts goodbye. Of course, Josh wasn't particularly attached to the military orders. With his trading system, selling the same syrup to Daenerys would yield profits far greater than selling to the military. But the title of military supplier mattered to him. This title was his ticket to climbing the social ladder in the US and integrating into elite circles of capital. 2 years later, when World War II ended, that title would become even more valuable. Whether he went to Europe or Japan, it would grant him a superior status, allowing him to extract resources at a minimal cost. So whether it was buying bonds or outright donations, he needed to maintain that status. Still, the way the military held him over a barrel left him frustrated. "Haha, darling, don't look so glum. Compared to Howard in New York, you've got it easy." He was outright conscripted by the military, Margaret teased, trying to comfort him. "I can't compare to him. He's an aviation expert." "I'm just a high school dropout," Josh replied, shaking his head. But he couldn't help but wonder, wasn't Howard Hughes supposed to live in Los Angeles? "Darling, you shouldn't underestimate yourself. You're only 16 and already own 3 factories and have secured military contracts. Especially with the glucose isomerase and high fructose syrup your sugar factory produces. Those are monopolistic products. Your future accomplishments will undoubtedly surpass his," Margaret said, wrapping her arms around his shoulders and leaning against him. "Oh, and guess what? This USO tour in Chicago includes many Hollywood stars, like Jane Russell, Whitney Frost, Paulette Goddard, and more. Especially Whitney Frost. Her performance with Judy Garland in Ziegfeld Girl was outstanding." Whitney Frost. Josh was confused. He'd never heard of her. Jane Russell, however, rang a bell. She was Howard Hughes' mistress and had faced backlash during World War II for wearing overly revealing outfits in a movie. Afterward, her roles dwindled to minor parts. "Let's check the program on the invitation," Margaret said excitedly. Josh smiled wryly and opened the invitation. The next moment, his expression changed drastically. "Margaret, what's the full name of the Howard you just mentioned?" he asked. "Howard Stark, of course." "Why?" Margaret replied, puzzled by Josh's sudden nervous tone. Standing behind him, Margaret didn't notice Josh's pale face as his eyes locked onto a program item titled Captain America. "Who's brave and strong enough to save America? Not everyone can storm the beaches, but we can all cheer them on. Who vows to fight day and night to defend the truth? E-Series defense bonds. Every purchase means another bullet in a soldier's rifle. Who spreads the word door to door, carrying the flag across the nation, from east to west, across the land? Draped in the stars and stripes, he bears it all." Unlike the previous small-scale charity drives aimed at the upper class, this time, the United Service Organizations, USO, were marketing bonds to the general public. Naturally, the venue wasn't a private mansion, but Chicago's Grand Theater. The Grand Theater, one of the top 3 in the United States, was built in 1865 and had been rebuilt once since. With a capacity to hold 4,000 people, it was the perfect location for such an event. Inside the theater, Josh sat in the VIP section, his smile frozen as he watched a muscular man clad in a stars and stripes costume awkwardly performing a musical number surrounded by singing and dancing women. Among the audience, Josh seemed to be the only one forcing a smile. The rest were clearly enjoying themselves, Their faces lit up with enthusiasm as applause echoed through the hall. "What's wrong, Josh? Don't you like the show? I think it's wonderfully done." Margaret, sitting beside him, clapped her hands excitedly as she asked. It's nothing, just not used to such lively crowds," Josh said with an awkward chuckle. But his demeanor couldn't fool Margaret. She had noticed Josh's distracted mood ever since they received the invitation days ago. Whenever she tried to ask, he would deflect with vague responses. What could he say, though? That he originally thought this was just a mundane parallel world where he could use his dimensional trading system to become a corporate tycoon, only to now realize it was the high-stakes Marvel universe? He was terrified out of his mind. No way he could explain that. The truth was, Josh had been blindsided because he didn't read enough newspapers. Coming from a digital age, he hadn't developed the habit of poring over newspapers. He only paid attention to local Chicago news, so it wasn't surprising that he missed information about Howard Stark and Captain America. When he finally read up on them later, he realized everything matched the movie version. Howard Stark's appearance, the scale of Stark Industries, everything aligned with what he remembered. In the comics, Stark Industries had been founded by Howard's father before World War I and had already become a powerhouse. However, in this world, Howard was born in 1917 in Manhattan's Lower East Side to a fruit vendor father and a seamstress mother. He graduated from university in 1934 and built his empire from scratch. Stark Industries wasn't formed until 1939 and was still a fledgling company reliant on military and British contracts. It was no wonder the company wasn't on Josh's radar yet. Realizing he was in the Marvel universe had been a shock, but after days of reflection, Josh calmed down. So what if it was Marvel? The truly dangerous era revolved around the Avengers' main storyline, which was decades away. For now, threats like Hydra operated covertly, and the risk wasn't too high. By the time the main events of the Avengers unfolded, New York in 2012, the snap in 2018, that was 70 years away. Who knew if he'd even lived that long? Though with the dimensional trading system as his cheat, his odds of survival were quite high. "Mr. Khan, why don't you take a photo with our Captain America? You've purchased another $1 million in bonds, and the public should see the contributions you're making," suggested Senator Brandt of New York, a key organizer of the USO drive, smiling warmly at Josh. Josh had purchased fewer bonds this time, but $1 million was still an impressive sum. Many larger amounts came from established financial giants. Given Josh's status as a young philanthropist, Senator Brandt saw him as the perfect example to inspire modern American youth. "Of course it would be my honor," Josh said with a practiced smile. "But could we take a few photos without the captain's mask? I think that would make for a more personal keepsake." "Certainly, that's a reasonable request," Senator Brandt agreed after a moment of thought. As Josh stood next to the maskless Captain America for a photo, he couldn't help but evaluate the man in front of him. "Captain, up close, you're even taller and more impressive than I imagined." "I wish I had a physique like yours," Josh said with a smile. "You flatter me, Mr. Khan. You're still young, and I'm sure you'll grow even taller and stronger," Steve Rogers replied earnestly. Steve couldn't help but admire Josh, who, at just 16, was already 6 feet tall. Despite his own transformation into a super soldier, Steve only stood about 6'2". After the photo, Margaret teased, "You said you didn't like Captain America, but you seemed pretty happy taking a picture with him." Josh smiled faintly and said, "Margaret, believe me when I say this, he will become a true hero, someone the world will one day look up to." Just as Josh was about to leave, a towering figure pushed through the crowd and approached him. "Dix? What are you doing here?" Josh asked, surprised. "Boss, we've got trouble. A shipment of ours was hijacked," Dix whispered urgently. Josh's expression darkened. Turning to Margaret, he said, "Margaret, I'll take you home first. Something's come up at the company." Margaret, sensing the seriousness, didn't ask questions and nodded quietly. As they left the theater, Steve Rogers, still on stage, glanced thoughtfully in their direction, having noticed the commotion. "Tell me what happened." After dropping Margaret home, Josh got back in the car and motioned to the driver to start driving. He then turned to Dix and asked, "Was it the cigarettes or the sugar?" By sugar, Josh wasn't referring to corn syrup. The corn syrup, being a new product, was tied to a government contract and entirely supplied to the military. However, Josh's sugar factory also produced granulated sugar on the side. The raw materials for this came from his deals with Daenerys, cheap, unrefined cane sugar or raw sugar from Westeros, processed into pure white sugar in his factory. Some of this was sold back to Daenerys at a premium, while the rest was offloaded into Chicago's black market, reaping enormous profits. The profits from the sales of white sugar and tobacco far exceeded those from the military contracts. But, as is the nature of illegal businesses, they were prone to attracting unwelcome attention. Josh had always known this day would come. Both 10,000 cartons of cigarettes and 1 ton of sugar, all of it ready for shipment to New York, was seized at the docks. 5 of our men are dead, 2 are critically injured, and only 1 managed to escape and inform me, Dick said grimly, his tone heavy with the loss of his subordinates. Hearing this, Josh narrowed his eyes. At a minimum price of $10 per carton of cigarettes and $20 per kilogram of sugar, the total losses amounted to a staggering $120,000. Any leads on who did it? Josh asked. Not yet. The operation was efficient. By the time we arrived, the goods were already gone, Dick shook his head. But I've notified both Mr. Schneider and Mr. Dietrich. They might have found something. Josh nodded and fell silent, lost in thought. Roughly half an hour later, Josh and his entourage of 3 cars arrived at Anna's diner. Anna was the widow of Lewis, the man who had been fatally shot during a jewel heist. Originally, Dix had taken care of Anna and her children out of sympathy. However, Anna's stunning looks and figure, which rivaled the best socialites Josh had encountered, had eventually won Dix over. Now, their relationship was serious, with marriage on the horizon. Because of this connection, Anna's diner had become the de facto meeting spot for Josh and his associates. The convoy of 3 cars was there for a reason: Josh's personal security. While Josh wasn't yet at the level of Chicago's top moguls, his growing wealth, influence, and public profile necessitated a personal security team. His security detail consisted of over 20 men, all hired from the refugee camps at the city's port. Chicago, being the 3rd largest city in the U.S., attracted a large number of immigrants. Those who lacked money or connections ended up in overcrowded camps, living in appalling conditions while waiting for immigration approval. These camps, with over 30,000 refugees, were barely a step above concentration camps. Hunger wasn't the issue, starvation wasn't allowed, but disease, cold, and squalor claimed lives daily. Josh selectively recruited family-oriented individuals, many of whom were former soldiers, prioritizing those of German, Austrian, and Nordic descent. With a generous relocation and settlement package, Josh secured their unwavering loyalty. At the diner, the only people inside were Schneider and Dietrich, who had been waiting. "Have you uncovered anything?" Josh asked as he sat down on the sofa, commanding the room with his presence. "Sheriff Dietrich has some leads," Schneider replied, indicating that Dietrich should take the floor. This wasn't surprising. Of everyone in Josh's group, Dietrich was the closest to being a true local power broker in Chicago. "Well," Dietrich began, "I've got informants in every district. After hearing about the theft, I had them dig around. Tonight, 5 groups in the city made notable moves. One was the old Italian Moretti family, and another was Fat Old Man Murphy's Irish gang. But both of these were involved in an all-out gang war, so they're not likely suspects. The remaining 3 are the Falcone family, another Italian group, the Wild Dogs, a Spanish gang, and a Jewish faction. My gut says Falcone is unlikely. They've been in decline since their leader Salieri was imprisoned 5 years ago. So that leaves the Spanish and the Jewish gangs as prime suspects." Josh asked, tapping the table thoughtfully. "Yes. But that's just a guess. We'll need to locate the stolen goods to confirm. There's always the chance it was the work of some ambitious upstarts," Dietrich admitted with a shrug. Chicago, being a melting pot of ethnicities and criminal enterprises, was rife with both large and small gangs. Every day, new gangs appeared while old ones disappeared. Josh nodded. While he didn't need the kind of evidence police would require, he still needed clarity on the culprits. Targeting the wrong group could lead to unintended consequences. For now, stay on top of it. Notify me as soon as you find any concrete information. We may not be a formal gang, but were not vermin to be trifled with. Also, Schneider, allocate funds from the shipment's revenue to compensate Dix. Give $10,000 for each of the deceased and $5,000 for the injured. Make it clear to everyone, those who fight for me will be taken care of. At the mention of compensation, everyone present was visibly moved. In this era, a typical gang leader might offer a token $1,000 to $2,000 to the families of fallen members, if they were particularly benevolent. Most deaths, however, went uncompensated. Even the U.S. military's death gratuity for soldiers was $6,000, making Josh's offer exceptionally generous for the time. Though they all knew this was a calculated move to win loyalty, none of them cared. A boss willing to spend like this was rare and worth following. For Josh, spending a few tens of thousands to solidify loyalty was a small price to pay. With the Dimension trading system at his disposal, earning money was the least of his worries. Beyond the lucrative black market profits from sugar and tobacco, his warehouses were still brimming with gold and silver from his deals with Daenerys. Speak up, what's the situation? 2 nights later, in the same restaurant, Josh asked Lyndon Schneider. Just half an hour ago, Josh received a call from Schneider with an update about the stolen goods. It was the Jews, Schneider replied. Are you sure? Josh asked. It's confirmed. The information comes from our partners in New York, the Corleone family, Schneider nodded. Originally, that batch of goods was meant to be sold to them. But according to the latest news, the goods have ended up in the hands of their rivals, the Marcellia family, whose collaborators in Chicago are the Jewish gang. Since we've identified the culprits, you know what to do, right? Josh stated firmly. Hearing the name of the Corleone family didn't surprise Josh. He was already aware of their existence. As the mastermind behind his growing operation, Josh didn't interfere in the day-to-day dealings, but he made sure to understand the basics. Key underground forces in Chicago, New York's 5 major mafia families, and large-scale gangs across the U.S. When Schneider first established contact with the New York faction, Josh learned about the Corleone family. He hadn't been overly concerned at the time. After all, he was already dealing with peculiar characters like Margaret from the Dial M for Murder and Sabrina, possibly a nod to the Audrey Hepburn film. Another connection to The Godfather didn't seem out of place. However, compared to the knowledge that Captain America and Howard Stark existed in this universe, the Corleone family seemed trivial. Boss, this might not be so easy to handle. Schneider hesitated before continuing. Oh, why not? Josh frowned. Because, according to the Corleone family, this incident wasn't orchestrated by Chicago's Jewish gang alone. It was sanctioned by the Marcellia family, Schneider explained. The Marcellia family? Luciano? Did our business offend him? Hearing this, Josh started paying closer attention. If it were just Chicago's Jewish gang, Josh wouldn't have been too worried. But if the Marcellia family was involved, it was a different story. The Marcellia family was led by none other than Lucky Luciano, one of the most significant figures in Josh's original world, known as the head of the Genovese family within New York's 5 mafia families. In this timeline, Luciano was still operating under the Marcellia family name, with Josh casually referring to him as Luciano because of his eventual rise. Luciano was also the mastermind behind the National Mafia Commission, Cosa Nostra, an unparalleled crime syndicate in the U.S. Under Luciano's leadership, the Mafia enforced 2 major rules: no drug dealing and no assassinations of law enforcement officers. However, several years ago, Luciano was imprisoned by New York Governor Dewey. He was currently serving as a librarian in jail, remotely managing the Marcellia family. Josh's operation, having only recently emerged, shouldn't have been significant enough to provoke such a powerful figure. Could this conflict stem from dealings with the Corleone family? But that didn't seem plausible. The balance between New York families typically discouraged open hostility. No, it wasn't Luciano who gave the order. It was his key lieutenant, Meyer Lansky, Schneider clarified. Meyer Lansky? But we've had no direct dealings with him, Josh remarked, puzzled. He certainly knew who Meyer Lansky was, Luciano's trusted partner, the brains behind many operations, and the godfather of Jewish organized crime in America, commanding immense influence among Jewish gangs nationwide. It's not about direct dealings, boss. Before we entered the market, Lansky's Jewish gang was the largest producer and distributor of contraband cigarettes in the country. Tobacco has been one of their primary revenue streams, Schneider explained. Our cigarettes are of higher quality and more competitively priced. I believe that's why they've moved against us." Schneider's explanation made everything clear to Josh. They had inadvertently encroached on the biggest Jewish gang's most lucrative territory. This was a tricky situation. Despite his rapid growth, Josh's fledgling operation was no match for an established mafia powerhouse like Lansky's faction. "How has the Corleone family responded to this?" Josh asked, his expression darkening. "They've chosen to stay neutral. They said they'll still buy from us if we can deliver the goods. But beyond that, they won't get involved," Schneider replied, somewhat helplessly. "If I had to guess, this was a warning. If we continue the shipments, similar incidents will likely occur." The Corleone family clearly wanted no part in a direct confrontation with Meyer Lansky. While tobacco profits were high, they weren't worth the risks of crossing Lansky's formidable network. Humph, they want the profits without the risk. What a convenient position. Josh sneered. But despite his frustration, there wasn't much he could do. Jews, they were indeed a troublesome group. Josh's expression darkened, his resentment going beyond the stolen goods. It also stemmed from his past knowledge in his former life. Many people knew about the persecution of Jews during World War II, but few were aware of the complex history between Jews and Josh's original home country. For instance, during the war, China had sheltered numerous Jewish refugees, yet some of these refugees colluded with Japanese forces, attempting to establish a Jewish state in northeast China, a plan that ultimately failed. Additionally, the infamous Chinese Exclusion Act had surprising ties to Jewish figures, such as Samuel Gompers, a Jewish-American labor leader. As a cigar maker by trade, Gompers felt threatened by the influx of skilled and affordable Chinese laborers in the cigar industry. His efforts to stoke anti-Chinese sentiment among white laborers laid the groundwork for exclusionary policies that reverberated across the U.S. Now in his current life, Josh found himself once again at odds with powerful Jewish factions, this time over the lucrative tobacco trade. "Meyer Lansky, huh? Definitely a troublesome figure," Josh remarked, tapping the table lightly in thought. It wasn't that Josh was afraid. But for someone of Austrian descent like him, Lansky's Jewish identity added an extra layer of complexity. Especially since Meyer Lansky wasn't just the godfather of Jewish organized crime. He also held another title, a prominent anti-fascist pioneer. During Roosevelt's New Deal era, Lansky collaborated with the government to dismantle the infamous American fascist organization, the Silver Shirts. This meant that Lansky not only wielded significant influence in the underworld, but also had extensive connections in political circles. For Josh, a new immigrant of Austrian descent, confronting someone like Lansky head-on would be unwise. However, a grin soon spread across Josh's face. Why confront him directly? Chances were, Lansky didn't even know Josh existed. After all the manufacturing and selling of goods had been managed by Lyndon Schneider and Dix. While Schneider was a German immigrant, Dix was a true blue Irishman. And those who had been killed or injured in the recent robbery. All 7 of them were Irish. In the pre-Black and Latino era, the 3 dominant organized crime groups in America were the Irish, Italians, and Jews. Which of the 3 was the largest and most widespread? It wasn't the Italians or the Jews. It was the Irish. The first major immigrant group among the 3, the Irish, were the true pioneers of American organized crime. However, the Irish mob had a significant drawback, a penchant for petty violence and poor organizational discipline. Many of their elite members were more inclined toward politics. As a result, over time, while the Irish rose to dominate American politics, the underworld power vacuum was filled by the more organized Italians and Jews. Herr Schneider, I understand your concerns. But have you forgotten? Dix and his men are Irish. And historically, the Irish have always been America's largest criminal group. They may be scattered now, but what if we organize them? Josh finally spoke, noticing Schneider's puzzled look. Schneider paused for a moment, then quickly grasped Josh's intent. It wasn't that Schneider hadn't thought of this. But for Germans of this era, with their Prussian-style education and reputation for excellence, they were typically part of the societal elite in fields like the military, commerce, politics, and research. Even criminals like Schneider often operated as highly organized thieves. They rarely saw much value in organized crime. This was why, despite being America's largest single ethnic group, there were hardly any German-dominated criminal organizations. Even if Germans delved into crime, They'd likely create groups like the Silver Shirts or paramilitary forces. But Josh was different. He lacked the innate pride of German-speaking people of this era. He was already imagining how powerful a gang led by the Irish but managed with German efficiency could become. And with the Mafia's organizational model already in place, it was just a matter of replication. If he couldn't even replicate something like this, Josh figured he might as well stay home and cuddle with Margaret. Not long after, Josh summoned Dix and Schneider, worried that Dix might act impulsively if he learned the robbery was linked to the Jewish mob. He had initially kept him in the dark. Jews? Boss, just say the word, and I'll gather my men and wipe them out. Predictably, Dix couldn't sit still after learning who was behind the robbery. If Josh hadn't been present to restrain him, Dix might have already been on his way to raid the Jewish mob's territory. Calm down, Dix. Revenge will come, but there's something else I want to discuss with you first, Josh said, motioning for Dix to sit down. Anything you say, boss. Dix reluctantly complied. Dix, have you ever thought about becoming a boss? Like Colosimo or Dean O'Banion back in the day, Josh said directly. T/N. Author mentioned both of them even though Colosimo was Italian. He deliberately mentioned Colosimo and O'Banion, 20th century Irish crime bosses in Chicago. He avoided referencing Al Capone, as Capone was Italian. While Colosimo and O'Banion were ultimately overshadowed by the Italians, their fall was partly due to bad luck and a lack of ruthlessness compared to someone like Capone, who wasn't afraid to use heavy weaponry. Boss, I'm not sure I understand, Dick scratched his head, confused by Josh's sudden proposition. It's simple. I'm planning to establish a gang. Let's call it the Blackwater Gang. But the boss won't be me, it'll be you. Schneider here will act as your advisor. You'll recruit soldiers from refugee camps to serve as instructors and officers. Beyond that, the rest is up to you. Find a plot of land in the suburbs and set up a training camp. All members must undergo military training. I know this may seem demanding, but with enough money, most people will be willing. I'll provide all the initial funding. Once the gang is operational, you'll continue distributing my goods, and I'll give you a 30% cut of the profits. As for other sources of income, I won't take a single penny, it'll all be yours. Josh continued, my only two rules are, no drug dealing and no human trafficking. Dix's face lit up with excitement. While straightforward, he wasn't stupid. He understood that under this arrangement, he wouldn't just be a puppet but would hold significant autonomy as a gang leader. Meanwhile, Schneider's expression turned complicated. To him, Josh wasn't creating a gang, he was forming a mercenary army. A militarized gang? That sounded terrifying. Add the right weapons to the mix, and groups like the Mafia or Jewish mob wouldn't stand a chance. Moreover, neither the Italians nor the Jews could replicate such a model. They weren't interested in military-style operations. They were in it for the money, not the fighting. After assigning tasks related to the Blackwater Gang, Josh returned to his regular life. The subsequent responsibilities were left to Dix, the newly appointed leader, and Lyndon Schneider, the strategist, to handle. Josh's only roles were to fund the operation and place a few accountants in the gang. Of course, it would take months for the newly formed gang to develop combat capabilities. After all, even the U.S. Army requires at least 3 months of training before deployment. But as the saying goes, revenge is a dish best served cold. While Josh wasn't willing to wait 10 years for revenge, he could certainly afford to wait a few months. Aside from occasionally checking on the gang's progress, Josh shifted his focus to Europe. With Captain America's emergence and nationwide tour, Johann Schmidt, also known as Red Skull, leader of Hydra, had made progress in his research on the Tesseract. Declaring independence from Hitler, Schmidt established Hydra as a separate faction and launched indiscriminate attacks against both Allied and Axis forces. With advanced energy weapons, Hydra quickly gained the upper hand. Notably, the infamous tank battle at Prokhorovka turned into a stage for Hydra's energy-powered vehicles. However, the Allies, oblivious to the true threat, misinterpreted Hydra's attacks on Nazi forces as a sign of victory. They took advantage of the distraction to land in Sicily and push into mainland Italy. By the time the Allies reached the Alps, having secured Italy, they halted their advance, waiting for Hydra and the Nazis to exhaust each other. Thus, World War II began to diverge significantly from traditional history, aligning instead with the trajectory of the Marvel Universe. For Josh, these developments were of little concern. He had no intention of altering history. Interfering could risk derailing events to the point where Captain America might fail to defeat Red Skull, leaving the East Coast vulnerable to destruction, a scenario Josh could not afford. Besides, even if he wanted to intervene, there was little he could do. Was he supposed to take the fledgling Blackwater gang to Europe and join the war? Josh and Margaret were playing tennis in their backyard. Although October had brought cooler weather to Chicago, the sunny skies and physical activity kept them lightly dressed. Margaret, despite being a wealthy socialite, was no fragile flower. On the contrary, she was quite athletic. Her previous marriage to a tennis player had also honed her skills. However, as a woman, she was at a disadvantage in terms of height and strength. Soon, she was out of breath, struggling to keep up. Josh, while not initially skilled at tennis, had spent nearly a year in this world, playing regularly with Margaret. Over time, his technique had significantly improved. Effortlessly serving, volleying, and smashing, he watched Margaret scramble across the court, amused by her determination and secretly admiring the scenery. Enough. Don't you know the concept of ladies first? Margaret pouted in mock frustration after failing to return a decisive smash. She handed her racket to a maid and plopped down under the sunshade, sipping iced tea. Speaking of iced tea, it might remind people in Asia of popular brands. However, iced tea was actually an American invention. Initially, both Asians and Europeans drank tea hot. It wasn't until the early 20th century that someone added ice and lemon to tea, making it an instant hit in America. While some sources claim iced tea originated in 1904, others argue it was 1929. Josh leaned toward the latter, considering the invention of the refrigerator in 1923 made ice more accessible to ordinary people. My apologies, darling. That was entirely my fault, Josh said, sitting beside Margaret and cheekily reaching for her tea. Sir, you have a call, interrupted a maid as Josh teased Margaret. Excuse me, dear. I'll be right back, Josh said apologetically. Go on then. I need a shower anyway. Pity it's too chilly for a swim, Margaret sighed, shooing him away. Josh smiled, said nothing, and went to answer the phone. Margaret headed to the bathroom for a shower. When she finished, she found Josh waiting in their bedroom. Margaret, you mentioned wanting to swim earlier, he asked with a grin. Yes, why? She replied, curious. How about a vacation in Florida? He suggested, pulling her into his arms. Really? Can you afford the time? Margaret asked, surprised. Despite Josh's daily leisure time with her, she knew he was busy managing factories and other ventures. Of course. My businesses are running smoothly. Everything is on autopilot now, Josh assured her. In truth, his decision had another motive. Chicago, and other cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Atlantic City, were about to descend into chaos. To ensure their safety and avoid suspicion, a vacation seemed like the perfect escape. Florida's warm climate and palm-lined beaches are perfect this time of year, Josh added. That's wonderful. How will we travel, by cruise or plane? Margaret asked excitedly. By plane. It's faster. We can charter one and reach Florida in a few hours, Josh replied. The iconic Douglas DC-3 had been revolutionizing air travel since 1935, though tickets remained prohibitively expensive for most people. For Josh and Margaret, however, cost was no concern. In fact, buying the plane outright wouldn't be an issue. It only cost about $20,000. Outside Chicago's Cook County Jail, 5 luxury cars idled across the street. Among them, in the middle car, Dix leisurely smoked a cigarette, waiting for the prison gates to open. Today was a special day for him, and for 2 reasons. First, it was the release day of his good friend Goss Minis. Goss Minis was one of Dix's former gang members and a key figure in their notorious jewelry heist. Following that case, thanks to Josh's arrangements and connections through Sheriff Dietrich, Goss had taken full responsibility for the beating death of Tony Windies. This ensured that Dix and Lyndon Schneider were either exonerated or granted bail, while Goss was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 5 years. But Dix never forgot his brother. Through financial maneuvering and legal appeals, Goss's sentence was reduced, and just 6 months later, he was being released. As the metal gates of the prison creaked open, a slightly hunched figure emerged, escorted by a guard. The hunched posture wasn't due to mistreatment. Goss had always been somewhat stooped. In fact, his 6 months in prison had been more like a holiday. He had a private cell, special meals, no mandatory labor, and even occasional female visitors arranged by Dix. Life inside had been comfortable, to say the least. This was the nature of a capitalist society. With money and connections, even a prison sentence could feel luxurious. Only the poor and powerless had to suffer hard labor and grim conditions. When Dix spotted Goss, he immediately stubbed out his cigarette and stepped out of the car to greet him. From his side, Goss, upon seeing the imposing figure of Dix, was overjoyed rather than envious. He wasn't new to prison life and understood well that without Dix's support, his time behind bars would have been far more grueling, let alone his early release. Seeing Dix waiting for him with such grandeur also made him feel that taking the fall had been worth it. "Haha, welcome back, buddy." Dix gave Goss a hearty bear hug. With his small stature and height of less than 5 feet 7 inches, Goss looked almost comical next to Dix's towering 6 feet 5 inches frame. Why all the fanfare? Bet this cost a fortune. Anyone who didn't know better would think some mafia boss was getting out. Goss joked. While he knew Dix now worked for a wealthy boss, he had no idea about the changes in his status and assumed the display was just to celebrate his release. "Haha, and who else could that boss be? Of course it's you." Dix puffed his chest proudly. "Allow me to introduce myself properly, leader of the Irish Blackwater Gang, Dix Handley." "Are you drunk?" Goss froze, thinking his old friend was joking. He even leaned in to sniff for alcohol on Dix's breath, but found nothing. "Get outta here. I'm dead serious. Enough talk, it's your big day, and I'm taking you to see something special." Rolling his eyes at Goss's disbelief, Dix threw an arm around his shoulders and led him to the car. Once inside, Goss began to sense that something was different. Unlike the 4 Ford V8 cars flanking them, high-end but relatively affordable, Dix's car was a Cadillac Fleetwood Series 75 limousine. This was a car fit for presidents, dignitaries, and crime bosses alike. Even across the ocean, prominent leaders used this model. In American movies, like The Godfather, such vehicles were synonymous with power. Beyond its luxurious interior and imposing size, what really caught Goss's attention was a small fold-out seat near the rear door and a strange object on the floor covered with a tarp. "Dix, what's going on?" Goss gulped nervously, recognizing the outline beneath the tarp. It was unmistakably a heavy-duty weapon. "Heh, I told you, I'm broadening your horizons," Dix replied with a sinister grin. At his signal, the convoy began to move. Goss sat tensely, his eyes locked on the object under the tarp. It was becoming clear that his old friend was no longer just a petty street thug. Dix had ascended to something much more dangerous. The convoy traveled for some time before stopping in a narrow alley. Rolling down his window, Dix called over a young lackey stationed nearby. "What's the situation?" Dix asked. "They went in about 15 minutes ago," the lackey reported. Dix glanced at his watch, nodded, and instructed, "Keep an eye on them." The lackey nodded and disappeared down the alley. Dix leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes to rest. Meanwhile, Goss sat frozen, afraid to ask questions. But he was starting to put the pieces together. He knew this area well. It was deep within the territory of the Jewish mob, one of Chicago's most powerful factions. After about 30 minutes, the young lackey returned, panting. "Boss, they're about to come out." "Let's move." Dix barked, snapping awake. The convoy started up and repositioned itself 2 blocks from the entrance of a high-end hotel. Moments later, a group of well-dressed men emerged from the building. These were the Jewish mob's top leaders, fresh from a meeting. But their instincts, honed by years of living on the edge, immediately sensed something was off when the convoy stopped nearby. They began to retreat and reach for their guns. It was too late. The windows of the front and rear cars rolled down, and the muzzles of several Thompson submachine guns poked out, unleashing a fiery barrage. From the central Cadillac, Dix signaled Goss to open the door. Dix stepped out and onto the fold-out seat, revealing the heavy weapon beneath the tarp, a Colt M1919A4 heavy machine gun. In the next moment, its deafening roar filled the street. Goss instinctively covered his ears as hot shell casings rained down on him, occasionally landing on his clothes and scorching him. In just half a year, his old partner had transformed into a true crime lord. And Goss, now caught in the whirlwind of this new reality, could only watch in stunned silence. Gunfire roared, and blood painted the streets red. Bystanders screamed and scattered in terror. Faced with the ferocious firepower, 7 or 8 Jewish gang members, including their boss and key leaders, couldn't even draw their guns before collapsing in pools of blood. Dix and his crew emptied 2 rounds of magazines and, without even sparing a glance, swiftly drove away from the scene. The entire operation lasted no more than 2 minutes. It wasn't until 10 or so minutes after their departure that the police finally arrived at the scene, sluggish as ever. Only 2 cars and about 4 or 5 officers responded, not because of negligence, but because at that exact time, similar attacks had occurred in over a dozen locations across the area. Without exception, all these locations were key strongholds of the Jewish gang. The only difference was the firepower used elsewhere. In most cases, attackers wielded submachine guns, whereas Dix's operation employed a full-fledged machine gun. By this time, Dix's convoy had arrived at an abandoned dock. All the used firearms and spent casings were collected and loaded onto a waiting boat. The boat then set off to deep waters, where the weapons were dumped overboard. Meanwhile, another group of Dix's men swapped the license plates on several cars, which were then driven off in different directions. These vehicles would eventually be taken to separate repair shops, repainted, and thoroughly cleaned of any evidence. Dix himself got into another car parked at the dock, taking Goss along with him. "How do you feel?" Dix asked, opening a case in the car and pulling out 2 bottles of whiskey. He handed one to Goss. "Intense," Goss said, taking a deep swig. "I've only ever read about something like this in the papers. It's hard to get used to." "Ha ha ha, you'll get used to it eventually, my brother," Dix laughed, clapping Goss on the shoulder. "Stick with me, and soon the entire underground world of Chicago will be ours." Goss took another gulp of whiskey. Though still in shock, he couldn't deny that he found the experience thrilling. The events in Chicago seemed to signal something larger. In the following days, in New York, several Jewish gang leaders were assassinated by highly trained attackers. In Atlantic City, 2 prominent Jewish gang bosses and their men were gunned down in their cars late at night. In Los Angeles, one of the most famous Jewish crime lords of the era, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, was taken out by a sniper. In San Francisco, the home of a Jewish gang boss was set ablaze. The wave of attacks on Jewish gang leaders quickly caught the attention of both the Italian mafia and federal authorities. For the mafia, the situation was personal. Ever since the establishment of the commission under Charlie Luciano, the Italian mafia and Jewish gangs had developed a close partnership. Jewish gangsters often acted as advisors to the Italians. Seeing their partners under attack, the mafia couldn't ignore the situation. As for the authorities, they couldn't turn a blind eye either. So many daylight murders couldn't go unnoticed, especially since many officials were tied to the Jewish gangs themselves. Initial investigations revealed a clear pattern. All the targeted individuals were closely associated with the most prominent Jewish gang boss in the United States, Meyer Lansky. In other words, the attacks seemed to be driven by a vendetta against Lansky. However, this clue wasn't enough to pinpoint the perpetrators. After all, as the top Jewish mobster in America, Meyer Lansky had more enemies than anyone could count. Based on the attackers' highly trained behavior, both the mafia and the authorities initially suspected agents of Nazi Germany or Hydra. The reasoning was straightforward. The attackers exhibited a clear European military style, disciplined and precise, operating like soldiers or covert agents. Meyer Lansky had a long-standing enmity with Nazi supporters. During the Silver Legion's rise in the U.S., Lansky organized Jewish gangsters to confront them head-on, often without using guns, relying solely on fists and determination to drive the fascists into hiding. Furthermore, Lansky had helped the FBI crack numerous German and Hydra spy cases. This made him a thorn in the side of both the Nazis and Hydra. Given these factors, both the Mafia and the FBI naturally assumed the attacks were orchestrated by external forces rather than an internal gang feud. Complicating matters further, the attackers didn't seize any territories, goods, or money from the Jewish gangs, breaking from typical gang warfare patterns. Faced with such an unprecedented situation, the Mafia quietly began absorbing the abandoned territories, while the FBI launched extensive investigations into recent European arrivals. Their efforts unearthed several spies, but they failed to uncover the true perpetrators. Meanwhile, the attacks continued. The focus of these attacks, Meyer Lansky himself, had yet to be targeted. This was primarily because Lansky wasn't even in the US at the time. He had been in Havana, Cuba, overseeing operations for nearly half the year. At the time, Cuba was under military rule, and American gangsters operated there with impunity, thanks to heavy bribery. When news of the attacks reached Lansky in Havana, he wasted no time preparing to return to Miami. Due to limited international flights, Lansky opted to travel by boat. Havana and Miami were only about 400 kilometers apart, a half-day trip by ferry. Upon his arrival in Miami, Lansky was met at the dock by his entourage, 4 or 5 cars and over 20 bodyguards, forming an impenetrable shield around him. But as they prepared to leave, a Ford pickup truck carrying a load of hay passed by. Suddenly, the hay was pulled aside, revealing a deadly weapon, a Browning M1919 machine gun, far deadlier than the one Dix had used in Chicago.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.